Welcome to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid. A set of conversations about our government, our politics, and the kind of country we aspire to be. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath, on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk.
Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. It is cold here in Chicago, but nice, sunny. We had a few technological gremlins that made me come in a little bit late today. Yeah, boy, but that's the least of our worries, right? This week brought a heavy burden, really heavy burden. The Supreme Court destroyed the Voting Rights Act, and that is arguably the most important civil rights law ever to come from Congress. This decision means that some Americans count more than others. Across the old Confederacy, that difference is entirely based on race. And already Republicans are moving to eliminate every district where a black candidate might win. I can't underestimate the horror of this. Let's be clear. The Civil Rights Act was destroyed not because it wasn't needed, but because it was working. That's why they got rid of it. And while the law was in effect, while it was fully in effect, American democracy became stronger, participation available to everybody, and voting made a difference. Today, democracy is weaker. Congress is considering limiting participation through their SAVE Act, and the Supreme Court has made sure state legislators, boy, I'm having trouble saying that today, state legislatures can gerrymander so that voting matters less. It's no wonder people don't have confidence in their democracy. They shouldn't. These guys have broken it. And John Roberts is the chief architect and chief engineer of the long campaign to destroy the Voting Rights Act. In a set of decisions, it's 10 years of work here, from Shelby versus Holder to Rucho and Brnovich and now Calais. He has returned American law as it relates to political power to pre-civil rights era. Think about that. He just erased the civil rights era when it comes to political power. Shameful. And it was more than civil rights he erased. This campaign and each decision that led up to this final week's destructive act result from a political court's political campaign for power, not from the jurisprudential practices of a nation governed by rule of law. The court ignored precedent, they ignored facts, and they twisted the Constitution to achieve their goal. So much for the rule of law, too. And it is not a coincidence that this same court that made racial profiling for the purposes of police action legal and made consideration of race in college admissions illegal is the one to destroy civil rights in America. It is neither a coincidence that that this court gave us Citizens United, which again ignored precedent and facts and the will of the people as reflected in a bipartisan act of Congress. And they did it to empower billionaires and corporate interests over American citizens. It is a court for the powerful and determined to bend the rules in their favor. This is a very bad week. Florida legislatures, Florida has in their own constitution, very strong protections against gerrymandering. Never mind, Florida legislators and their governor said their own constitution can be ignored so they can gerrymander a few more districts. So it's not just civil rights, but the rule of law that takes a backseat to the right-wing consolidation of power. And it's power they plan to use, and they plan to use it against us. Pete Hegseth told Congress that the real enemy in Iran is free speech in America. At the same time, Donald Trump called for ABC to fire Jimmy Kimmel, and his FCC is pressuring broadcasters to fall in line. And CBS has. This week, 60 Minutes edited a Trump interview to make him look a whole lot better than he did on the raw footage. And never mind that same CBS paid Donald Trump to settle a case when he claimed they edited Kamala Harris to make her look good. By the way, they did not do that for Kamala Harris, but they paid Trump anyway. They're coming after us. This week, Trump's Justice Department indicted former FBI Director James Comey for the second time, this time for taking and sharing a photo of seashells at the beach. The seashells spelled out 8647. The Justice Department stands there pounding the podium with a straight face. They contend that that photo constitutes a credible threat to Donald Trump's life. Think about that. Everyone else, not the Justice Department and not Trump, everyone in America knows that's the Justice Department acting like it belongs in Putin's Russia rather than any nation governed by the rule of law. And you know what? That's why they did it. Because they don't want us to think that the law will protect us. Power only. The deadline passed for the president to get approval from Congress or cease fighting in Iran. The president's still at war in Iran, and Congress isn't about to weigh in. So much for the rule of law. It is a very bad week in America. These are, as Thomas Paine told our founding generations, the times that try men's souls. He wrote that in The American Crisis in December of 1776, when that new revolution looked like it might be snuffed out, when a powerful British army had broken out of Boston and was undefeated and scouring the country. And George Washington, he was barely able to keep his ragtag army together. And Paine wrote, "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country." And in America right now, those corporate titans sure have. But Paine went on. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. And we hold this democracy of ours very dear. That is why you guys are not sunshine patriots, but the real ones who will stand through this trying time. I have a great show for you. We'll be back in just a second.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
All right, everybody, welcome back. I'm joined by Kate Riga. She covers our friends at the Supreme Court for Talking Points Memo, where she also co-hosts the podcast that many of you have seen with Josh Marshall. She is really on top of this miserable moment, and I wanted to check in. Kate, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I guess relevant to the moment we're in, can I just start with this? Why did you become a reporter, and why did you decide to focus on the Supreme Court?
Well, initially, when I moved to DC, it was to cover Congress, and this was March 2020. So, a very cool time to be around our very geriatric congressional leadership. But Congress has just become so paralyzed, in this hyper partisan era that, for the first 2 years of the Biden administration, it was really exciting because, there was the trifecta and there was the possibility of legislation.
Yes.
But soon after that, it became so inert. And, for better or for worse, clearly here for worse, the Supreme Court has been very active, so it felt like kind of a more productive use of my time to focus there.
Do you think that paralysis in Congress is the partisanship only, or do you think Citizens United has contributed by taking Republicans out of legislating?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely both. And then you have the institutional blocks, the Senate filibuster most primarily, that, some of us had hoped that in 2021 would be its ultimate demise. But of course, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema saw to it that didn't happen.
Yeah. And saw to it that, well, you know what, I'm not even sure, had we passed the John Lewis bill, had we passed all these voting reforms, that this Supreme Court wouldn't have just brushed them away as they did the bipartisan McCain-Feingold bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, as we're thinking about kind of a hypothetical 28 Democratic trifecta, which really seems like the first opportunity to at all address the Calais decision, you're completely right. I mean, John Roberts will be immediately struck down, right? That was just an attempt to restore the VRA to its former glory. And then even something like the For the People Act, which would, do things more like enact nationwide gerrymandering reform and mandate these independent commissions. It's so hard to see any world where this Supreme Court would even allow something so neutral to pass, right? Knowing that it just would run completely counter to their partisan interests.
Yeah, I know it's quoted a lot. And for a long time, it was quoted by the right in America, but I still think there's wisdom in Madison's Federalist 78, which was about the judiciary. And he wrote that liberty can have nothing to fear from the judiciary alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with the other departments. And here we are seeing that, where the judiciary has decided not to be disengaged from politics and not to think about the facts and the law and the Constitution, but rather to use the power of the judiciary to uh, strengthen a political faction. It's enormously dangerous to freedom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you think about the kind of prior vision of the three branches, where the judicial branch is, comparatively the weakest, right? Because the legislature is the people's branch, and the executive. There's always been concern from the beginning about, an unbounded, super powerful executive, and now, especially in this new decision, you have a court that completely contradicted congressional intent and also tossed away, all the work of the lower courts. There are just absolutely no checks on this body right now, and they're acting accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, let's go through some of the history because um, I feel like I'm a lot older than you. I'm in my late 60s. So the work of my lifetime has been like I was a boy when much of the civil rights fight went on. And it feels like we are now, from a legal perspective, the law in America, at least as it relates to political power, is where it was before the civil rights era. And that is so disheartening. So let's just talk about it because he didn't do this right away, and we should name them for people. Um, we had Citizens United, which said corporations should be able to give whatever they want, right? People can't. People are limited in the campaigns, right? They had Shelby versus Holder. And can you remind people what that one was?
So this is a 2013 decision that, for all intents and purposes, nullified Section 5 of the VRA, which was one of its most effective pieces because it forced jurisdictions, particularly in the South, that had histories of racial discrimination in its voting practices, to get any changes in voting laws cleared with the federal government first. And, this was very purposeful at the time because, fighting voter restrictions in these areas, people just likened it to fighting a hydra, right? You would address one and they would immediately pop up with something else. So this was a very kind of post Bloody Sunday effort to address that constantly mutating attack on voting rights. And in Shelby versus Holder, the court said, the formula we use to determine which of those jurisdictions need pre-clearance, no good, but no worries because Congress can just go back and write a new formula, knowing that Congress, by 2013 was not in a place where, there was a big enough kind of democratic control to pass a new formula that could actually help this part of the law be enforced.
And we now know if they had, he'd have struck it down.
Exactly.
And then in 2019, we had Rucho. That one, as I remember, was when he said, "I'm sorry, folks, the doors are closed. You cannot come to the federal courts on a gerrymandering case."
Which is almost comical now because the reasoning there being, Federal courts are just not competent enough to deal with partisan gerrymandering claims, from the same body that claims complete, expertise in everything from, kind of micromanaging the technical regulations of
Mhm.
agencies and everything else, right? Like they have no problem kind of appointing themselves masters of everything else that comes before them.
And it's a gerrymandering case they just took,
Exactly. Yeah.
right? Yeah. And then Brnovich was the one that said, oh, yeah, you can have racial gerrymandering as long as you pretend it's political gerrymandering.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And now they just got, in this case, just got rid of. Okay. So much for uh, voting rights in America. They also, I mean, I don't understand, in Trump versus Anderson, they wrote new language in about, this was the Colorado case about 14th Amendment. When Colorado had a trial and said, oh no, we're looking at the evidence. Trump is an insurrectionist. And so he's not allowed to hold office. And the Supreme Court, now this was not just the 6
Yep.
Republicans. They said it's too complicated. We're in a mess if that happens, which I think is all of them, the Democratic appointed ones as well as the Republicans, saying that it's their job to fix the Constitution rather than to follow it. Shame on them, all of them.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, especially in the particular VRA vein, we got Allen v. Milligan 3 years ago, which was just like this
Right,
Louisiana case, another garden variety, racial discrimination and redistricting case out of Alabama, where the majority, led by Roberts, said, this is likely racial discrimination. Sorry, Alabama, you have to draw another majority minority district. That was 3 years ago. And
right.
now Alito's pretending, oh, we're not overturning that with this decision. Yes, you are.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. Is it possible that there will be no Black representatives coming out of the South?
Oh, completely. Yeah. I mean, and the only thing I think that would keep that from happening is if, your Tennessees, your Mississippis, your states that currently only have one Democratic slash Black representative just do the math and are too worried about imperiling other Republicans because they've already, squashed all of those Black and Democratic voters into one district. So it would not be for like any interest in kind of preserving the voting rights of that part of their populations.
It's just so disgusting. Yeah, let's talk about corporate power for a minute. Did you see those um, leaked emails that the New York Times ran on the origin of the shadow docket?
Yep. Hmm.
Do you want to just take a minute and talk to people about that? Because like Roberts and Alito, they wanted to stop Obama from regulating the oil and gas industry. Right?
Right. And it stemmed from, I think and these are just kind of like internal memos that the justices use to communicate with each other. Someone
Mhm.
leaked them to the New York Times. These are a bit old, years old, and they just kind of
Yep.
publish them in full to say, here, look, make of this what you will. And Roberts's piece was so interesting because he's saying he wants to basically let the attorneys jump from a stay handed down in the district court. He wants to leap over the appellate court in between, take it right up to the Supreme Court, so they can kind of, get involved faster than they're supposed to be. Because in the past, I think it was a rule about limiting mercury in water or something, but it had moved so slowly through the courts that the industry that it regulated had just decided, you know what, we're just going to comply with this regulation rather than kind of waiting for it to fight through the court system. And, Roberts is, God forbid, that happens again with coal pollution. So we
Right.
have to get involved really fast so that doesn't happen again. And even in the kind of buttoned up, restrained language of the justices, you have Kagan being like, "What? That's not how it works. That's not the standard. We're supposed to be the court of last review. You have to let these things kind of move up the chain." But Roberts, and of course backed by Alito and their direct interest in, the industry pressure here, are like, no, 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 we have to, go in the wrong order, get involved faster, and make sure that our buddies don't have to comply with this environmental regulation.
It's so telling because Alito's note said, if we don't do this, the very legitimacy of the court is in question,
Right.
right? And so let's see, if you don't follow the normal procedures, if you don't let the lower courts do their job, right? If you don't wait for the percolation they've talked about to
Hmm.
get to the court, somehow that makes you illegitimate, unless what he really means is we are legitimate if what we're doing is defending corporate interests against democracy. And that seems to
Exactly.
be what he thinks the legitimacy of the court is.
Exactly. And you can even see that in their discussion of harms, right? Like the irreparable harm they are concerned about is the monetary harm to these industries and having to institute this regulation. There is no concern about the harm to, the human beings who will be and the environmental effect of just letting, the pollution spew into the atmosphere. And that's how they always are. Whenever you can tell by who they give their sympathy to where their loyalties lie, right? And that we see that over and over again, like in Dobbs, right? That's Alito saying, women are not without electoral power, but the harm to state freedom is so immense. It's just they make it very clear kind of who they are concerned about protecting.
Right. And when you're supposed to balance equities, which is one of their jobs, if they've decided that some sides are more equal than others, you really can't count on them to balance anything.
Exactly, especially because, monetary harms to businesses are typically like one of the least important harms because that is irreparable harm, right? Like they could be paid back, but harm to the environment, harm to people's health, how do you repair that?
So you and I are on a dangerous path here. Um, and it's this, and I've struggled a lot with this. We need a functioning Supreme Court in America. It's just that the structure of our democracy requires it. And so when we go on these conversations, and I have them, where I say out loud, our Supreme Court is not a legitimate Supreme Court. We put the rule of law in jeopardy. And people look at me and they say, you can't do that. That's a terrible thing to do. And I want to say the weight of all of the evidence is that they've done it to themselves, and denying it um, is no way to fix this problem. And I just wonder how you think about that, because it's a terrible thing to say the Supreme Court of the United States is not legitimate and should, and that their rulings um, don't legitimately have the force of law. They do because they have power behind them, but they don't have democratic force.
Yeah, I mean, it's awful, but I think it's worse to pretend that what's happening isn't happening, right? To kind of give them an integrity that they don't deserve. And this has been coming up all the time, as I'm sure you're having conversations about too, but court reform, right? And how some people, good faith people are still balking at the idea of court expansion because of the concern that then you're in this race to the bottom and every administration that takes over will kind of contort the court to its needs. And I mean, I think that's a valid concern, but it's just what is your option on the other side? That you have a Supreme Court for a generation, at least, maybe longer if Alito and Thomas retire at the end of this term, that is a comprehensive veto on every Democratic administration and will completely clear the field of any obstacle for Republican ones. I mean, that is just not a status quo that we can live under.
I wonder if there was a single moment that you just said, I've crossed this Rubicon. This court just has lost me and can't get it back. It was there one?
I think personally, by the time I was, in the industry, because Citizens United was before I was a professional journalist, but it had to be Dobbs. I mean, that was the first one that we knew it was coming, but still, you're refreshing the Supreme Court opinion page. You see the title, you see the A next to it. That means that Alito wrote it. And it was so as harmful as it was, as much as it ensured that women were going to die, it was also just so sneering and so dismissive and such kind of a victory lap that we had just left the land of this kind of earlier iteration of the Roberts court where there was this feeling that, well, Roberts really cares about institutional legitimacy, right? Like he's going to put some kind of restraint on the court's more radical elements. But by that point, with a decision like this that was sure to unleash political backlash and their just complete lack of concern about even tempering the language, that was just a moment where it was like, they are completely comfortable being openly partisan actors at this point.
Yeah, that's, scholars have always said there were some legal issues with Roe, that it wasn't,
Hmm.
that, I mean, uh, uh, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought there were some legal problems with Roe. So while I hated the decision, I didn't lose confidence because of the decision, but the language that you're talking about it was really partisan. And then following quickly after that was Trump versus the United States,
Of course, yeah. That's
right?
probably the worst one. Yeah.
Yeah, well, ending civil rights is pretty bad too.
That's true. There's hot competition for that
Yeah,
title.
yeah. So now they have temporary protective status in front of them.
Mhm.
And tell everybody what that is, why it's important, and what is at stake.
So, temporary protective status is this kind of special provision for refugees to the United States who are coming from countries that are just completely unstable, violent, dangerous, whether that be kind of natural disasters or civil war or, government violence. And so the Trump administration kind of came in and immediately ended TPS for roughly a dozen countries that had it. And the tricky thing about this case is that the attorneys for these cases are specifically about Haitian and Syrian TPS holders. You can't challenge the DHS's secretary's ultimate decision whether to terminate that status or extend it. That is not judicially reviewable. So they're left kind of fighting on this much smaller bore procedural grounds of, did then DHS Secretary Kristi Noem arrive at her decision to terminate the TPS status in the ways that the statute dictates? And what she has to do is so minor. All it requires you to do is examine the country conditions and consult with other officials. So in more well-meaning prior administrations, that would entail, DHS getting together with state and saying, give us an update. Is Haiti still as dangerous as it was when we first issued this status, and kind of going from there. But very similar to a lot of these agency firing cases we saw at the beginning of the administration under DOJ, even these kind of simple box checking exercises, the administration just refuses to do. They just kind of want to act with impunity and then would rather expend the time and expense to fight it all the way up to the Supreme Court and win there, rather than just do what this requires, which is really just, sending a few emails, basically. So that's the oral arguments they heard the same day that they handed down the VRA decision. And then the Haiti case has an extra dimension of an equal protection claim, because this administration has obviously said so many disgusting things about Haiti in particular, that they are also adding on an argument that, this was incentivized by a discriminatory viewpoint in the first place.
Well, okay, so the Solicitor General was asked, I think, if Donald Trump's comments were racist,
Yep.
right? And I can't remember which of Donald Trump's racist comments he was asked about. But it was one or two in particular. If you remember them, what were they?
At this point, I think it was poisoning the blood.
Right, are the Haitians poisoning
JD,
American
yeah,
blood?
JD
Yeah.
Vance is eating the
Are they
cats and
eating cats and
dogs.
dogs? And is
Yeah,
that racist? Yeah,
right.
and Sauer was not able to have an opinion on that.
Right. Well, he said, no, I mean, look at the context, right? He's talking about the crime rate in these countries, prompting Justice Jackson to jump in and say, so is it the United States position that comments like that are only racially discriminatory if we have an actual racial epithet used in the comments, right? That's the only way we can know.
Yeah. And his answer was?
No, 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 no.
No,
Not
because
racist. No
because they'll
worries.
have racial epithets and they'll say they didn't mean it.
Exactly.
Okay, so any tea leaf reading on that one?
It seems almost certain that the Trump administration will win. All the conservatives were totally okay with this. And, if you come from the perspective of giving them a little more, quote unquote credit, the court has long deferred to the executive on matters of immigration, I think,
Mhm.
to a fault, and on this point, they were just carrying that same kind of like, oh, this is within the administration's purview. We don't really want to get involved. And then you had the additional point of, at one point, Justice Barrett was like, if we rule for you, the TPS holders, what does that really get you? And there is that layer to it that even if the TPS holders pulled off the unlikely win here, now Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen would say, okay, fine, here is my correspondence with the State Department. We are ending TPS status,
Yeah.
right? So this whole thing is just kind of a bid to get these poor people like a little more time, you know?
Well, it's a more than that because even if it's a box that Mark Wayne Mullen has to check, that means that the president isn't just the king of everything.
Yeah,
He doesn't
that's
just
fair.
get to say, I thought they should leave, so they left.
Right.
So I'm all for holding him to whatever shred of process is in his way.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
did you see the piece? Again, the New York Times ran Thursday. It wasn't there. They reviewed body cam footage of ICE agents in Tennessee. It wasn't
Okay.
there. It wasn't there. They showed widespread racial profiling. They
Mm.
showed the impacts of Kavanaugh stops. And um, uh, and I just want to get your sense of how you can square it's okay to racially profile for all matters where the state is using force against you, but you cannot use it in college admissions where you might get a chance to, like how do you put those, how do you square that in the rule of law?
Yeah, I mean, you can't, right? It's just that totally lays bare the just hypocrisy, you know? And similarly with this VRA case, right? You can't use race to ensure that minority voters are given electoral power. That is somehow a violation of the Reconstruction Amendments,
But,
right?
but you
Which
can use race to take it away from them, which is what they did
exactly.
in this case.
And you can subordinate the rights of minority voters to the partisan gerrymandering interests of red states, right? I mean, race kind of can only be used when it's being used to hurt minorities. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor kind of criticized publicly the Kavanaugh stops concurrence in a recent
Mhm.
speech she gave at a college or something like that, and then came out with an apology and said, I shouldn't talk about my colleague that way. And this came a day or so within Clarence Thomas going on this like public screed about the evils of progressivism, and I did not see
Yeah,
any follow up apology from that.
nor will you.
Yeah,
Another case they took up was the one that says um, you mailed in your ballot 15 days before the election, and the Postal Service got it, stamped it, and then took 16 days to deliver it, and now maybe you don't get to vote.
yeah.
Um, uh, uh, why did they take that case?
Yeah, it's funny. This case is so, it almost feels like old fashioned kind of Republican voter restriction because now they're just swinging at such bigger pitches. But yeah, the grace period thing is something Republicans have hated for a long time and have tried to kind of fight in various ways. This is the first time it seems like the court will probably come down on their side,
Mhm.
which arguments that used to kind of work on a more conservative sensibility in the past included that this will hurt military voters profoundly, right? I mean, those people are mailing in ballots from all over the world. So, of course, they're going to need a little more of a flexible timeline to receive it. And then this has also been something of a not a slam dunk for Republicans because another area of the country very dependent on mailed in ballots, rural areas, right? Heavily Republican rural areas. So this is all under that bucket of Trump hating mail in voting and deciding it was the reason that he never really lost his elections, quote unquote. But, if he did, it's because of fraud and mail in voting and that being a crusade, and how we've seen the Republican parties kind of incoherence in response to this. Occasionally they'll be like, you're right, Mr. Trump, mail in voting sucks. And then they're like, well, this is
But we
hurting
need
our
it.
voters too. So maybe we should
Yeah.
reverse course on this.
My theory is that the court took the case. They shouldn't have taken the case. There's never been any fraud in
Right.
this, right? And they know that, and it goes against their own conservative principles in so many ways. In an era when the president of the United States is trying to make people distrust elections, a court that cared about elections would not have taken a frivolous case that is based on the lie that somehow our elections are in jeopardy. So I think it was part of their effort to undermine, well, again, a different way the court, just by taking a case, can undermine our democracy.
Yeah,
Shameful. Shameful.
absolutely. And you can even see that in, I think it was the Secretary of State in Alaska, who obviously Alaska needs mail-in voting. Like this would really hurt, you
Yep.
know, voters of all stripes there. And even at this point, someone like that who is in an election administration position in a state where you need to mail in voting put out this very like anodyne statement about how, oh, we want to make sure everyone can vote and we hope that the justices kind of take that into consideration. Like so cowed that a Republican official at this point cannot even say this is bad for our state, including Republicans, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. We only have a certain amount of time left, and I want to spend some of it on your fabulous piece, Inside the Parallel Universe, which you wrote. Nonpartisan Alito is under assault from the rabidly violent left.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because that just, yeah.
Yeah. So I read Molly Hemingway's new book. She's the editor in chief at the Federalist, or editor at large, something like that. And she wrote this just hagiography of Alito, which was, when I first started it, I thought it was funny because Alito is like famously curmudgeonly, right? So trying to dredge up these anecdotes where he seems human and likable, like she's straining from moment one to kind of find examples of
Well,
that.
you gave one in that piece. Like, okay, he didn't just cut in front of everybody in the
Exactly.
line, and that somehow makes him a human being.
Yeah, he didn't get a reservation at a restaurant and then he left. Can you believe it?
Oh my. Right.
I have to, yeah, he is a fan of the Phillies, and you know that because she reminds you every 2 pages. That's really the humanizing element
Yeah, I
here.
was a Cubs fan. That doesn't help him much.
Exactly. Yeah. But as I got further into the book, I mean, it was almost a hallucinatory understanding of the current moment, in particular with this specter of leftist violence that is always right about to strike and is fatal and is so dangerous. And I think the way that struck me most that this came up is when the Dobbs opinion famously leaked to Politico shortly before it was released. Huge deal, right? We had not really seen leaks of that caliber from the court before. And in her telling, it is a straightforward example of open warfare on the conservatives, that the biggest concern was that they were going to be assassinated in order to deprive the court of the majority it needed to pass Dobbs, and that the liberal justices, by taking a while on the dissent, were collaborators with these, unnamed, unidentified kind of pro-choice assassins, and that they stretched out the time it would take in order to give those people more time to kill the justices. And this is based on, go ahead.
It's insane, right?
Yeah.
It's insane. But we now have to we now have to say they believe it. It's not anymore okay for us to say it's just insane. The sun is out today and they're saying it's nighttime. Of course they know better. They're just saying it to get under our skin. Now, everything we've seen from January 6th on says they will act on this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I live in a city where they sent their troops. I get it. They are going to act on this stuff. So how, I mean, um, when you got in there and you showed that they really are crazy in
Mm-hmm.
this sense, they're crazy what they think. Um, and is it your sense that when and if they lose power and the other guys gain power, that they will have the new crop will have the courage to do something about this? Or will they say, oh, we just need to kiss and make up and come back together, which is what Joe Biden did. And then the whole country got our ass kicked because of it. So I'm wondering whether you think we'll make the same mistake twice.
I think it would be fatal if that happens. And I have long been concerned that we have not had a huge amount of evidence yet under kind of current Democratic congressional leadership in particular that the lessons of the Biden era have been learned. But I will say the response to the redistricting arms race buoyed me a bit. In the past, I think the Democratic Party would have said, that sucks, but we're doing independent commissions because, we believe in democracy. And this was the first big example we saw of kind of gloves off. Fine, you do this, we are going to respond, right? And Hakeem Jeffries, I will say, in response to the Calais decision, said, okay, we're going to gerrymander the heck out of California, Illinois. We're getting Maryland back on the board. We're not going to take this lying down. So that was a good suggestion.
I think the last place you will see the courage required to do this is in Washington and amongst the leadership there. They're used to playing let's make a deal for the last 50 years, and it's worked for them. But out here in the rest of the country, oh, you are seeing it.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, and you're seeing it a lot too, I think, in some candidates who are running right now, right?
Everywhere, from dog catcher to Congress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, in Maine in particular, right, we just saw Janet Mills, a successful governor, bow out before the primary was even finished. And she was the kind of the handpicked Schumer candidate, had the establishment backing and was getting just whooped in the polls, right? I mean, it does give you an indication that voters will not abide by the same kind of mold of old Democrat.
Yeah. And I want to say to everybody listening, we may not have a free and fair election, but they didn't have one in Hungary 10 days ago either. Show up in huge numbers and we'll be okay.
Yeah.
But, we have to show up in huge numbers because as the people you watch, those nice people in the Supreme Court, all bets are off on what they think.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Listen, it was a great pleasure to talk to you today. I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, I would love that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, wait. Tell them where they can find your work.
Yes. So I write at talkingpointsmemo.com, TPM for the cool kids. I co-host the Josh Marshall podcast. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Blue Sky, Kate Riga. So yeah, find me there.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, everybody. Coming up next, a couple fabulous discussions on international law and on the Middle East with
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
I am joined by Dana Spalt. I cannot tell you how grateful I am. She directs research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She previously served all of America as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for the Middle East. That's important. That's the Pentagon's highest civilian official for that complicated part of the world. And she's worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so she knows American foreign and military policy at its core. And she knows it in this volatile, frightening, entirely messed up part of the world. So, Dana, thank you. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Before we start on the Iran war, which I think is what I want to spend most of my time with you on, I think we have to talk to everybody about the landscape over there pre-October 7th. What that looked like, where, and what has happened to the Iranian proxies since. So that sort of sets the table, I think, in a way that will make sense for people.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. And I think talking about the pre-October 7th Middle East, it's important to remember what actually the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration had attempted to do, which was wind down these big, sometimes people call them forever wars in the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, right-size U.S. posture, military investments in the Middle East. But there was also a view that the real challenges to U.S. leadership and U.S. national security came from the Asia-Pacific theater, from China. And so part of how we thought about protecting U.S. interests was reducing some of those military investments in the Middle East. We've been so focused on countering terrorism, fighting Al Qaeda and ISIS in the Middle East, and really thinking about how to transition the bulk of our military investments and commitments to another theater. And also, I think the pre October 7th landscape important to remember is that during the Biden administration, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so there was a lot of focus, a lot of national security focus, not on China and the Asia Pacific theater, not on Iran and the Middle East, but actually on shoring up U.S. investments and commitments to our allies in the European theater and countering Russian unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. So the landscape of the Middle East before October 7th was thinking through right sizing U.S. military commitments and investments in the Middle East. But there were also the Abraham Accords. There was the beginning of this idea that Israel was beginning to integrate and normalize with the rest of the Arab world. There was a lot of military integration and cooperation that was going on. And so, generally, the focus in the Middle East was on not increasing U.S. military investments, but really transitioning to these longer term security and strategic commitments beyond the security file.
Okay, that's not what I was expecting, but because and that is so at odds with where we are. So we have a world where legitimate, ongoing, growing challenges in the Asia Pacific region that we have a national security interest in addressing, a new challenge in Europe, which we have a national security interest in addressing, and a present reality where we've taken from both of those theaters to put back in the Middle East for reasons yet unknown.
Yes, and I think so October 7th and the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel was this reckoning both with assumptions about how Iran and its network of terrorists and proxies and non-state actors were calculating their own interests in the Middle East.
Yes.
And what I think is really important about that post October 7th period are two things. One is that from a military perspective, despite what I just said about really trying to focus on the Asia Pacific theater and on the European theater, what Biden did was plus up the military posture in the Middle East. He sends two aircraft carriers to the Middle East,
Right.
much more air defense, really does all of these things to support Israel's ability at the time to defend itself. And the real concern at that moment, immediately after October 7th, was that Iran would activate all of its terrorists and proxies across the Middle East. So not just Hamas, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, proxies in Syria, the Houthis, an Iran backed partner in Yemen, and then that even Iran itself could directly attack Israel. And so the emphasis from the post October 7th period was both protecting U.S. investments and our own forces who were deployed across the Middle East, but
Mhm.
also supporting Israel's ability to defend itself.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden went there. He sent more forces there and at Carrier Group, and he said, "I have a message for those who would take advantage of this situation. Don't." I remember that. Um, but he also encouraged Israel not to make some of the same mistakes the United States made after 9/11, and they didn't listen to him either. So nobody listened to him.
Well, I think there's the part of the story of the post October 7th period is that Israel was able to defend itself and go on the offensive against threats that before we didn't really contemplate using military force in this way. Both Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then prior to the current war of 2026, remember Iran attacked Israel in April 24, in October 24, and then last summer in 25, there was the 12-day war. And in each of these cases, Israel defended itself. And at times, there was even an international air defense coalition to support
Right.
Israel in those efforts. But all of Israel's ability to take on these different threats very much relied upon that increased U.S. military investment and commitment and resources that Biden sent to the region, and then Trump in his second administration continued.
Yep. So the proxies have been weakened. Um, that means that Iran's calculations, just forever, Iran knew that if there was um, a military engagement, it was going to happen um, on the borders of Israel. It was going to happen with its proxies. Now, with they're so weakened, it's happening in Iran. And that's probably not what they had in mind. Um, but at the same time, Israel's response to October 7th has cost them the support of millions and millions of Americans. And it's hard to know because it's a very tough neighborhood to get truth out of. Um, but they're very credible arguments of war crimes have been committed by the IDF, and we don't have an ability to adjudicate that yet because it's still ongoing. So I don't know in the long term whether Israel's security is better or worse because of this. Certainly, their moral authority is not what it was, and I think maybe irreparable. We'll see.
Well, I think there's so much to unpack in what you just said, and so I'm going to try to take a few different elements of it and respond.
Yep.
The first is that when we talk about the threat from Iran, this is a radical regime whose core interest is in surviving, right? And extraction from the Iranian people. And the way the regime, since the founding of the Islamic Republic, has attempted to ensure its own survival is by investing in strategies to keep the war away from Iran. So that was the proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, at one point Bashar al Assad, the ruler of Syria. And then it was the ballistic missile arsenal, and then more recently, the drone
Mhm.
arsenal. The idea that don't contemplate attacking us because we can unleash complete havoc across the Middle East, targeting
Yep.
not only Israel and the tens of thousands of U.S. forces, young men and women deployed across the Middle East, but also could target civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, all the things that we've just seen. And the third pillar of what the Iranian regime used to ensure its own survival was the nuclear program. And
Yes.
of course, this has been a shared interest of the United States, basically the entire
The
world, the
entire world.
Europeans,
Yep.
Russia, and China at one point
Yep.
to prevent Iran from crossing that nuclear threshold and obtaining a nuclear weapon capability. What is, I think, different about the post October 7th landscape is that Israel took on Hamas and attempted to degrade and collapse the organization. Then it took on Hezbollah.
Hmm.
Then it took on the Iran proxy network inside Syria that had
Yep.
thrived under the very welcoming umbrella of Bashar al Assad. It also took on the Houthis. And then, after being attacked by Iran, responded in April 24, October 24, and then finally last summer in the 12-day war. Um, so I think it's important just to recall that for a long time, the world has been rather aligned on the threats coming from Iran. And
I think
what
we still
we
are
never did,
largely.
I think there's so much focus on the current state of what did we actually achieve in this current war that was very much led by the United States. Just to be clear, this was a Trump decision to get into the current war. That we are losing focus on what the ultimate objectives here are,
Well, let
and
me
the
back up.
ultimate.
I agree with you,
Sure.
Beth. Just I uh, love your three-part. This is what Iran did to protect the regime that's in power. Very clear. But I want to ask one question about that and put myself in Iran's shoes. Um, I spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and the Sunni Shia conflict overhangs almost everything, maybe bigger even than the Arab Persian conflict. And from Iran's perspective, they're, they would say, look, we needed these proxies because the Shia populations in all of these countries were under enormous stress and danger from the Sunni majority. And that was true all around, and that was what they were doing. I don't believe it, but that's a at least from if you put yourself in their shoes, which I think you have to do to negotiate with anybody, that's at least part of what they were afraid of, and not without completely without basis.
Yeah, so I'd rather look at the fact pattern rather than trying to put myself in Iran's shoes here. I think the bottom line here is that the
That's why you
regime
did what you did and did it well.
right. So look, the regime in Tehran is a kleptocratic regime
Yes,
that has ensured its own survival at the expense of the Iranian people
every day,
every day,
every day.
including in January perpetrating the worst massacre against the Iranian people who would like some very basic freedoms, the opportunity to have a stable currency, to keep the lights on, to have jobs, to not be forced to dress the way the regime tells them to dress, to express their views in media, to have access to the internet, very basic
Yeah.
things.
Water
And
security. Yes.
basically, there's not a Sunni majority in all of these countries. I think it's much more complex and rich ethnic, religious,
Hmm.
sectarian fabric in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, etc. And generally, what Iran has done is weaken central governments, cultivate and foment its own interpretation, a radical interpretation of Islam, of
Yep.
Shia Islam. Um, it has armed sub-state actors that do not respond to the will of the people. It has taken on targeted assassinations of people who dare to speak up against what they think is malign, nefarious Iranian influence. So I think that whatever the regime might say publicly, and for certain Tehran has been extremely effective in the propaganda war, we need to call out what this is. And at the end, what follows Iranian influence across the Middle East is corruption, human rights abuses, armed sub-state actors that undermine the authority of these states, and generally lead to more instability, trafficking of weapons, trafficking of drugs, etc. It
Yeah.
hasn't been good for the Middle East.
Yeah. I think there is in the United States, bipartisan and around the world, global understanding that Iran is a bad actor, both for its government, for its own people, and around the region. And for those of you listening, for a while I worked in Beirut, and if you wanted to go from one side of the town to the other, sometimes you had to cross Hezbollah checkpoints. The government does not control the country. It doesn't have sovereignty over that nation. So it's a very complicated mess.
Now, all of that being said, even if there's alignment on the problematic policies and strategies coming from Tehran, I think there's a different discussion on the wisdom and the objectives of the current war that has just been waged
Right.
and what the end goals are. And getting back to something we were talking about before, which is the way in which these different Iran supported and backed actors have been degraded since October 7th, there is without question, I think, a real struggle by the United States and Israel right now to transition from military operations to however you would sustainably leave the region in a better place. And
Hmm.
what we know from the wars that have already been fought in the Middle East and anywhere else is that nothing ends with military instruments alone, that there has to be a political process, that there has to be civilian led vision, that there has to be diplomacy. And that I think is the real inflection point we're at now in the Middle East, which is an inability to actually define a political process, get stakeholder buy in, and put other tools on the table other than military force.
Yeah, well, both Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump confuse a target list with a strategy, but that is a real problem. 10 minutes before we launched this latest war, there was an enormous opportunity. I mean, you had all of those proxies weakened, and you can argue, everybody will, that the way they were weakened was inhumane, but leave that aside just for this moment. They were much bad. They were badly weakened. There was turmoil inside Iran. The leadership of Iran was ancient, and we had deployed military around to increase the pressure before Iran knew what that military could do and might not be able to do. So we were in the best position to negotiate a different kind of a future in that region than I think we've been in years. And we didn't have the patience or the strategy or the guts to do that. And we blew that opportunity. That's my view, but I'd like yours.
There's a lot of speculation about what happened in those talks as the military buildup was happening in
Mhm.
the Middle. And I think one of the most plausible theories is that this is an administration who does not appreciate history, does not value outside expert advice, and has certainly not relied upon the wealth of technical, historical, and diplomatic experience that they have in our State Department in the United States, in the intelligence community, etc. And so what happened in those talks, the President Trump has empowered the same people really to lead almost every single major file on the national security agenda for the Middle East, for the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, etc. And all of those are his son-in-law Jared Kushner and one of his personal friends, Steve Witkoff. And by all accounts, in the rounds of negotiations that Witkoff and Kushner led, they didn't bring with them a bench of technical expertise and diplomats. And I think when it comes to previous nuclear agreements that were arranged with Iran, it took years to get those agreements. And we brought technical experts, non-proliferation experts, intelligence professionals from our Department of Energy, from our CIA, from our State Department. And none of those people were present during these negotiations. So was there a missed opportunity? I think it's fair to say that had we put in more effort, we might have been able to make a better case. Either that the Iranian regime was completely intransigent and unwilling to make concessions, or at least proven to the world that we were willing to give diplomacy a chance. And because those things did not happen, the United States has found itself extremely isolated internationally as it waged this war. And most Americans don't understand it and don't support, and the polling really backs that up.
Oh, you mean it's not okay for the president to give a lengthy State of the Union message and not tell Americans that there's a credible threat against us, so credible that he thinks we should go to war the next week and not mention it once? Yeah, that really, or not tell any of our allies or partners that we are going to effectively shut off their power supply, their oil for the foreseeable future. Yeah, America's never been this alone.
I mean, not only that, it appears that the Trump administration didn't even notify the dependent families of our deployed forces across the Middle East, our diplomats and our diplomatic families. Embassies weren't given a heads up. Embassies didn't send any warnings to either to American citizens that were in the Middle East or to our own families who are serving in these countries. So, no, we didn't really take care of our own people in the Middle East. We certainly didn't take care of our allies and partners, and especially not only Israel, but when it comes to our partners in the Gulf and Jordan, these are partners that have stood by us, host U.S. military bases, host U.S. forces, and they weren't given a heads up either. And they've really taken the brunt of Iran's retaliation. The United States should and must do better by our allies and partners.
Well, this is not. This is an extreme example, but I was in Riyadh when Barack Obama said there is a red line in Syria, and if Hafiz Assad uses gas against his people, we will retaliate. And then Barack went to the podium and said, "Oops, I have changed my mind." And my Saudi friends looked at me and said, "We will never trust the United States ever again." Now they did. They got over it and they trusted Donald Trump because they felt a kindred spirit with him. But I'm not sure they will ever trust the United States ever again. And then that's not just the Saudis, but around that region, we have proven to be a very difficult friend.
I agree with you. I think if you are a government in the Middle East and you look at the big swings in U.S. policy, and we can go much further back
Yeah.
than President Barack Obama,
Yeah.
there are big swings in American foreign policy in the Middle East based on who is in the White House, and that lack of predictability is very hard in the Middle East. And I think it's also important to remember, from a governance perspective, there's only one democracy in the Middle East. So the monarchs of the Middle East, when they look at U.S. foreign policy, they are thinking in generations, and we are thinking in 2 to 4 year terms. And that mismatch of priorities and a greater sensitivity, I think, to public opinion in the United States because of our electoral cycle makes it very hard. I think it's not only a question of our Arab partners in the Middle East. Look at Europe. I mean, we are in this administration, questioning things like our commitment to the NATO alliance. So yes, I agree with you. I think this very much diminishes the confidence of our allies and partners in the United States, and what has always been our value added, our strategic asset that nobody else has is that unmatched network of alliances and partnerships, which has enabled us to do all sorts of things for decades.
I don't understand how that can be because, and well, yes, I do. But I want to ask you if where the failure is because uh, the strategic interest of America in the world do not change every 2 years. That's just not. It doesn't happen that fast. Our politics may change, but the strategic interests of the United States are it's a big ship to turn, and those interests don't change every couple of years. So how is it that policy has become so disconnected from the strategic reality in very important places on this planet?
Well, we could spend hours and read books about this issue. I think a few things. One is at a very broad level, we are still living in a post COVID, post pandemic world, and the information environment has completely changed. So, what
Hence, you and
America
I are speaking on Substack rather than ABC News because a lot of the public now, or CBS News, a lot of the public is like, wait a minute, what? Right, a whole different information ecosystem has happened,
I think it's not
for
only a
good and ill.
information ecosystem, it's a choose your own adventure information story. So, based on your worldview, what you choose to listen to, what you choose to
Yep.
watch, what you choose to consume, where you get your information is so localized and so tailored. And so that's number one. Number
Yes.
two is I think our leaders generally don't do a great job talking to the American people about what we gain from a rules based international system in which the United States is a leader and what it means to work with allies and partners. And what that means is that we don't always get our way first all the time. It is that what is good for us is also good for others. And what we've seen, I think, especially with the current administration, is this very narrow focus America first, transactionalism. If you are gaining something that's bad for me in a zero sum game. And I think a lot of Americans are misinformed about what U.S. assistance does, what U.S. military investments abroad do and deliver for American security.
Hmm.
And so I think going forward, we have an information issue, we have a basic education issue. Americans need to do better at understanding our role in the world and how a resilient, economically prosperous global ecosystem actually is good for
Or
America.
else has been. Yeah. Wow. All right. Let me go back to this current conflict. Um, I mean, I think that we were emboldened to attack this time, not just because we sent children to do adults' work in negotiating, but because Iran was weaker. Having the proxies gone, we can attack a country that's weaker, not because it's stronger. I think we attacked them because they were less of a threat, not because they were more of a threat. But did this attack weaken the regime further, or do you think it has strengthened the regime inside Iran?
So, at a conventional level,
Yes.
I think we've weakened the Iranian regime. So, in terms of what the military campaign attempted to accomplish, let's set aside the mixed messaging at the presidential level.
So you're not
Our,
talking about strategically, you're talking about tactically,
I'm talking
right?
operationally.
Yes.
Our
We blew up a
military,
lot of stuff.
100%. Our military leaders have been very consistent in what they were seeking to do with military means.
Yes.
Set back the nuclear program,
Yes.
set back or neutralize not only the missile arsenal and the missile launchers and the drone arsenal and the drone launchers, but also Iran's military industrial complex to keep building more drones and missiles. Also, the Iranian Navy. And then we did have the United States working in a unprecedentedly combined manner with Israel, and Israel took on other targets, very specifically decapitating the top civilian and military leaders of the Iranian regime. So, all of this taken together, I think you can look at it, and the estimates are that we destroyed 80 to 90% of their conventional weapons arsenal. So, we've set back these threats for years. The challenge is how the Iranians responded, and that's largely asymmetric. They did not seek to match us missile for missile, airstrike for airstrike. They didn't have an air force. That's not how they responded.
Pause
What
there
they
for 1 second. You were in those rooms. Was there 1 second where where people did not expect them to respond asymmetrically? Was there 1 second where people didn't say, "Yeah, you know what? They don't have the conventional forces we have. They're gonna do something different?"
No, I think when it comes to this, and just to be clear here, I've served under 4 secretaries of defense, and I've seen 3 presidential administrations, and I also looked at this issue set when I was in Congress, and I believe in terms of US leadership and upholding and backing up US commitments,
Hmm.
we always said that there was a credible military option on the table should diplomacy fail.
Yes.
The risks of what a conflict with Iran looked like made it incredibly important that you exhaust every possible outcome diplomatically and a political resolution to this because of the understanding that Iran would respond asymmetrically, its proxy network that had developed across the Middle East, its missile arsenal, its drone arsenal, and the fact that we've seen Iran respond before when it has been under pressure by threatening freedom of navigation, not
Which
only in the Strait of Hormuz.
geography is in their favor on this.
Absolutely, and we've seen them play these cards before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, I think it was absolutely predictable that the Iranians would respond by escalating quickly and asymmetrically and seeking to impose political and economic pressure in response to our military pressure.
Yeah. Okay. So this is part of your answer that the question was, have we strengthened or weakened the regime in Iran with this action? You said conventionally we've weakened them, and that was a military answer. Are they more likely to fall than they were? Or are they more likely retrenched? They now have a younger generation. They have so we missed the opportunity to get them at the when the old man dies. Um, w- uh, what about unconventional? What about the rest of the answer?
So, first of all, what's clear is that this campaign did not collapse the regime. If anything, what it facilitated is a more hardline, more militaristic regime in Tehran. Whereas before, at least you had a supreme leader, and I don't want to defend this guy, but he played a balancing role between the different power centers in Iran.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, what's quite clear, I think, is that the IRGC is calling the shots in Tehran, and the IRGC has been the part of the Iranian regime charged with ensuring the survival of
Of
the
the regime.
Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
So these guys are unlikely to make the grand bargain that would be in the US interest on the nuclear file, on the missile file, on the support for terrorism, all of these things. And then beyond the fact that it's going to be harder to negotiate with a post war traumatized but surviving regime, is that they discovered a fourth card to play in their response. And that fourth card is freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Hmm.
And what they have learned is that they can bring the global economy close to a standstill. The pressure, especially in Asian countries and next European countries, is so intense right now. And for the Gulf countries, they really depend on being able to export goods, not only oil products, but others through the Strait of Hormuz.
Fertilizers. Yeah.
Fertilizers, helium, we can go on and on.
Yeah.
So, Iran is not blocking the Strait of Hormuz with a conventional navy. They're doing it with the risk of one fast boat, one suicide boat, an anti-ship ballistic missile fired from some fast craft.
Yep.
And so this asymmetric threat and the fact that insurers and shippers are not going to try to transit the Strait of Hormuz and people do not have confidence that the US military can ensure them on safe transit is a major strategic challenge for the United States right now.
Yeah, and one that we didn't have a month ago, or 2 months ago. Wow. Okay, that's a 50-50 question on whether the regime is stronger or weaker. It depends
I,
on where you look, that's the answer.
I think it depends, and I think it's the timeline. You have to consider the timeline. So at this moment in time, it's not stronger conventionally, it's not stronger economically. And if this war ends, the problems that plagued the weekend regime before that brought protesters out to the street
Are still
remain and are going to get
bigger, and they're bigger. Yeah, yeah. Um, we've also heard a lot of talk, and I just don't. Again, there's no way the public can know the truth because everybody seems to be lying. Um, have we dangerously reduced our own stockpiles of weapons? I mean, this conversation has gone on a lot. People said, "Well, we also have degraded our own capability dramatically." and in a way that will take years and years and years to it, and more money than is imaginable to undo. What's the status of that?
So, in terms of the objective numbers of our stockpiles, those are classified and for good reason. So, we're
Yeah,
never going to know. But
right,
I
right.
think it's important to pay attention to the trend lines. And the trend lines before this war were worrying. There was an active debate about the American defense industrial base not being able to produce either munitions or missile interceptors fast enough. And the U.S. military was taking from its own stocks for both Ukraine and Israel well before this war in 2026. And
Hmm.
I think it's also important to pay attention to the reporting from last year, 2025, during the 12-day war, that the United States used a significant amount of its missile interceptors to support Israel's defense when Iran's retaliation was only aimed at Israel and not the rest of the
But
Gulf.
not the rest of the Gulf.
And so now what we're going to have a challenge with when you listen to the numbers, CENTCOM, US Central Command, our military that executed this war, has been very public in reporting the number of strikes, the number of sorties, the kinds of munitions that they used in their offensive campaign. And when you add those numbers up, and then you look at this big $1.5 trillion defense budget request that the Trump administration just debuted, and then you listen to the debate that happened recently with Secretary of War Hegseth in Congress, we're probably only scratching the surface of how many munitions we used, both offensively and our missile interceptors to defend against Iran's retaliation. And it's not just the US military that we need to replenish. We also have a lot of partners and allies that buy from us. And
Hmm.
they've been really busy defending themselves in the Middle East and in Europe. So this is a really big piece of business. There's a lot of focus on whether defense industry can move fast enough, but the bottom line is it's going to take years to replenish.
So does that mean that we are at greater risk in Asia of of Chinese mischief? Ukraine is its own uh, different case. They've learned to live without us, and that is a different issue for America. But
Well, first of all, I think that if there were to be a war in the Asia Pacific theater, it's not going to look exactly like this one. So it's not an
right.
apples to apples, the kinds of munitions, the kind of defense, those sorts of things. Number two is, I think there's clearly active consideration in Beijing about how they best secure their interests. And of course, there's this big summit coming up with Trump in a couple weeks in May. But I think that they are certainly looking at the experience of what they just saw the US and Israel attempt to do in Iran and absorbing lessons learned for what it means for potential war in the Pacific theater.
Hmm. Yeah, not that it matters, but if I were China, I would let us continue to be self-destructive, and we're only damaging ourselves.
There's
Um,
been some very good public reports from the US intelligence community for years now that talk about what China is seeking to do, which is to remake the existing US led international order in a way that is more conducive to Chinese interests. And so I agree with you. If you're China and you're looking at the ways in which the United States is eroding our alliances and partnerships, actively bringing questions into whether or not we're going to stand up for these long held values and principles that we've upheld really since the post World War II and then post Cold War international order, I'd agree with you. I think they probably have more to gain from just watching us self destruct.
yeah, I mean, we thought for a while China didn't believe in this order, that they were trying to evade it at all costs, and that we were imposing an international set of rules and laws and the institutions that support it. And now China's figured out that chaos isn't good for them either, and that since we're abandoning those, they're betting that we will not descend into an imperial world, but that they can step into our place, leading a rules-based world.
And they're actively messaging as such. They're
Yep.
actively saying clearly you can't rely on the United States. They didn't look out for you. They didn't give you advance warning of this. You're much better off working with us.
Oh, all right. So there are some other things that have happened during this war that are interesting. I don't know where to place them. Maybe hopeful, maybe at least setting the groundwork for hopeful. For instance, I think I read that Israel sent Iron Dome uh, 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 capabilities to the UAE, and the UAE said to the IDF, "You can come and man them." That's different, at least.
It's absolutely different. It's quite significant. So a
Yeah,
few things here. What is, I think, really unique about this is that when the news came out that Israel sent not just Iron Dome, but Iron Beam, so this laser that can
yeah,
help
yeah.
intercept the short range missiles and the drones, the UAE stood up and affirmed it and said, yes, this is a friend and a partner we had a need, and they were there for us in our hour of need. Um, and if to think about a pre-Abraham Accords environment where any Arab would have said, yes, we actively welcomed Israeli forces on the ground, boots on the ground in our country was unthinkable. Um,
Unthinkable.
so
Right.
I do think that Israeli technology, defense technology, and what they've done with their really unprecedented layered air defensive system to defend against Iranian attacks. If you look at the rest of the region, you have to be thinking at this point, what is Israel willing to share with me so that I can better protect my own infrastructure and
Yeah.
people?
Yep. Yep. And I also look at this and I'm like, China, Russia, they have nothing here that's really impacted this. They're involved, they're helping, but they haven't. It feels like Turkey, maybe Qatar, maybe the UAE, are these sort of middling powers are showing that they have a stronger hand than the ones we thought were the real powers, and that also has some interesting implications for the future.
Well, first of all, I think we are only beginning to understand what a post Iran Middle East order might look like. And there is this theme of middle powers in the Middle East stepping up and mediating, whether it's Turkey and Qatar
Yeah,
in the Gaza Hamas situation, Oman, then Qatar, then Turkey, and now Pakistan in the US Iran situation. There's been all sorts of interesting alignments related to other issues. Um, and then, only in the past week, we've seen, I think, this resurfacing of UAE Saudi rivalry. So
I wanted to talk about that too. Yeah,
one might think that after the experience of these Iranian attacks, you'd see more emphasis on unity and collective defense in the Middle East. And at least right now, that's actually not what's happening. I also think in the coming weeks and months, we're going to find out more about ways in which military and intelligence cooperation likely deepened with Israel and the United States, even if the public mood music was not very supportive of this war.
so let me just be sure I understand this, because the coalition of countries over there has stayed together in part because of the perceived Iran threat for a long time. So now there is a there's a strengthening military tie between those nations and the United States and Israel, but maybe not between the Arab nations themselves. So there's rivalry there. Um, it,
Yes,
right,
there has
very complicated.
I think there's always been rivalry, but a
Yes,
lot of that rivalry was not coming to the surface because the priority threat was Iran, the
right.
immediate threat. And now that that threat has been pushed back, we're going to see what this looks like in sort of a post Iran region. And it's also going to be an interesting time for the United States because, on the one hand, um, the Washington didn't consult with any of these countries about its decision to go to war, and I don't think it was consistently saying, "We think this threat is absolutely imminent and requires war at this moment in time."
Mhm.
But on the other hand, what these countries had been doing by and large was working with Iran, maintaining diplomatic channels to Iran, not rigorously enforcing the sanctions on Iran out of a view that if they kept things calm and open with Iran, they wouldn't be attacked.
Targeted, yes,
And
and now
that's
they
not.
were.
And that is exactly the opposite of what has happened. So
Yep.
you're one of these countries and you look at who actually supported your defense, it is the United States and Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, complicated world over there. It's going to require enormous diplomatic talent, something that we have recently shown that we lack. Um, worrisome for sure. It's open for anybody, I guess, to make the case for the future there. But one thing that is in the way of the future there is the enormous humanitarian disaster that that these wars have left. And first and foremost is in Gaza, but southern Lebanon and good chunks of Iran um, are in ruins, and people are suffering. And I mean, leave aside the numbers of people killed. The people who are still living this is unconscionable for the world. How do we um, address the humanitarian disaster to begin to restore any moral high ground, but also the kind of trust you need if you're going to build a future?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. I think not only is nobody focused on any reconstruction, rehabilitation, or what it takes on the other side of war, but there was no planning for it. Not in
Mm,
Gaza, not in
no.
Lebanon, and certainly not in the Iran case. And we also have societies and countries that are still on the other side of deadly conflict: Syria, Yemen, Iraq. And the United
And
States
Lebanon terrified of another civil war.
absolutely terrified, and massive population displacement,
Yes.
and a U.S. position right now, aligned with Israel, that there will be no reconstruction until disarmament of Hezbollah. And a challenge here, I think, is there's not a real consensus about what disarmament completely is and when we'll know. But I think it's safe to say that that's going to take a long time. And the children of Lebanon, the children of Gaza, shouldn't have to wait years to be in safe spaces, to have access to services, to have access to schools. Parents shouldn't have to wait. The United States, I think, has done itself a tremendous disservice by the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development, and most of our programming for things like U.S. assistance, U.S. humanitarian aid. The United States is also not investing in international organizations that could be doing some of this work, like the United Nations. So there's tremendous space here. And then I should also say, we've fired a lot of, in the Trump administration, a lot of the technical experts and assistance experts that actually know how to do this work.
Mhm.
But what we do know from Iraq and Afghanistan is that the military cannot do all of these things, nor should they be asked to. And so we need
Nor
to,
will they be trusted. I mean, there's a reason why we have defense, development, and diplomacy, and they're in separate houses. But this crowd has said, oh, no, sorry, this is all the military. And our military guys will set up baseball fields and all of that stuff.
and if you go
It,
back in the history,
yeah,
secretaries of defenses, they all say, if you don't invest in development in these things, I'm going to have to buy more bullets. So generally, you've had secretaries of defense pleading for more emphasis, more funding, and more empowering of the other two Ds, the
yep,
development and diplomacy.
yep.
So I think that there just has to be more light shown on these issues. Frankly, leaders, members of Congress, American civil society, and others need to keep thinking about this not just through a military lens, but through a human lens. That if we do not urgently address these issues, we may have achieved something against Iran's proxies and set back these real threats in the region, but we are about to lose a generation.
What we have are, I mean, a proud administration saying we are the Department of War. We are the most lethal ever. Um, what we need are leaders who are peacemakers and understand what that takes. And that requires us to be tough with our friends and our adversaries alike, and to say that the human life matters and that we cannot do this to people. And um, it's very hard to measure the gains against these losses and say we are strategically better off and have lost our humanity. And American support for all of this is eroding. It'll be tough to pass a big defense bill. I think it should be tough to pass. It should be impossible to pass $1.5 trillion defense bill. But what you do inside it, whatever the size of it is, those are tough decisions. And they need people like you who got to get back in there and help them make these decisions, because it is a goddamn clown show. Sorry, that's me. I get to be, yeah.
Listen, I agree with the first of all, I think it's very important that Americans are asking tough questions. about this war and about where our emphasis is in the dollars that the administration is requesting. And this announcement of the $1.5 trillion defense budget, remember, it's just the first step. Congress really gets a say here.
Yes, we do, because
And
zeroing out any help for Ukraine in it is probably also a thing that we should pay attention to.
yes, I will say that when I was a Senate aide, I remember one very noteworthy member of Congress telling me, well, we're going to do with the president's budget what we do with all presidential budgets, put it in the trash and do what we want to do. And so hopefully there are people on
Once upon a time, we had a legislature that decided that Article 1 of our Constitution was worth something. We'll see if we get back to that.
agree with you. I think it's very important to pay attention to the voices that really are raising concerns about war powers, the president's authority to continue this war in the Middle East. And it is very important that members of Congress advocate for diplomacy and development dollars alongside whatever
Yep,
the
yep,
defense budget debate is.
yep. Well, this is day 60. This is the day that the War Powers Act says, you know what, you can't keep going. Um, uh, it- it's going to pass with little notice, right? Because the rule of law is also an issue here. We are weakened along with the people we're fighting. And God knows our government was stronger when it had the talent in it like you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom, and for the service you've given all of us.
Thank you for what you're doing. Pleasure to be with you today.
Bye.
You're listening to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
I'm joined today. I am very lucky to be joined today by Una Hathaway, who is a Yale professor multiple times over, right? At the law school, in the Department of Political Science, at the School of Global Affairs. She directs again, got to get this right, the Yale Law School Center for Global Legal Challenges. And recently she became the president of the American Society of International Law. And that is just the Cliff Notes version of her accomplishments. So Una, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
I have wanted to have this conversation for a while, but I'm not sure I'm going to like what I hear.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
I am in my late 60s. I've benefited my whole life from a global order whose roots really predate World War II, but whose institutions got built after that terrible, terrible disaster. And now I see that order and those institutions under attack here and elsewhere. And I'm not sure what replaces them. I don't think it's chaos. I think it's China, but we'll talk about that. But I'd like to, spend our time together to understand what we had, what we might be losing, and what might come in its place.
Yeah, good. Those are great questions. So what we had, I think there's nothing like putting something at risk to understand what you had. So what we had was, in the post-war era, we put in place a remarkably effective system for keeping the peace. Not perfect by any means. We can point to all kinds of violations, but the data is very clear. The number of wars between major powers was basically zero. The conquest, which used to be very common among states, states taking land from one another, used to be very common, happened for hundreds of years, basically reduced to very rare. Does happen on occasion, but quite rare. Overall, peace was much more widespread and a lot less war. And this was an intentional choice. This didn't just happen. It was because we had lived in a world for hundreds of years where states could resort to war whenever they liked. They were allowed to go to war for whatever reason they liked. In fact, it was the main way in which international law was enforced, was through war. And international law said you could use war to resolve your disputes. And so it was a decision. It was an intentional choice to reject that system, first in 1928, the Calabria Pact, which obviously didn't work. And then in 1945, with the UN Charter, which reaffirmed that, created a whole institutional structure around it. So now all that's at risk. And we realize
that's just the peace side of international law. There's an enormous commercial side of international law that also grew up so that prosperity would grow alongside peace.
Yeah, and the two are intertwined, right? I mean, you're much freer to trade. You're much more willing to put valuable goods on a boat and ship it across the world if you believe that somebody's not just going to take it. You're much more willing to engage in trade relations with your neighbor or partner if you don't think that you're enriching somebody who's going to turn around and attack you. And so the two are very much intertwined.
Well, but let's talk about, I mean, people just don't know how pervasive this has been. I mean, people know about NATO, they misunderstand it. They know about trade, but not about WTO. They know about war crimes, but certainly not about treaties the U.S. never signed. And like, I know no one thinks about international law when they get on an airplane in one country and land in another, but somehow that works just fine, right? How much does the system of international law and the institutions that make it possible impact our lives every day?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at a kind of deep truth, which is that international law kind of sets the background features of our lives in ways that we just don't really understand. So the internet, is governed in part by the International Telecom Union, which is one of the oldest international organizations in existence. When you make a phone call or you use global communications networks, you're taking advantage of international law in the International Telecom Union. When you send, a letter from one country to another, and isn't it kind of amazing? You can buy a U.S. postage stamp, stick it on a letter, and your grandparent in another country can receive it. That is international law at work. When you're flying from one country to another, there's a whole web of international agreements that allow you to overfly those countries safely and securely without being threatened with being shot down. So it's a whole web of relationships that we don't really notice, except when they break down, right? We notice it when it starts to fail. We notice it when it's violated. But when it's working well, it's just kind of the background of our lives. But it's so much the background of our lives that we ought to, begin to understand how critically important this web of relationships really is to enabling modern life.
Yeah, when we think about it, as you began, as questions of war and peace, but it's really much more pervasive in our lives.
Yeah, it is. I mean, obviously, war and peace are critical because you only get the rest of those relationships working well if you kind of trust one another, right? If you're not sort of fearful of one another. But yes, I mean, international law, there's well more than 50,000 international treaties. They're on every you can possibly imagine. Yeah, I mean, on every topic you could possibly imagine. This is why teaching international law is sort of a crazy thing, because it's like teaching law. It's like everything.
Where are these treaties? I mean, here in the United States, we have a system of law. I'll talk about that in a second with you. But all those laws result, we can figure out what's current law because they get put in a code of federal regulations, the CFR. And you pretty much can tell what the body of law is in America that way. Is there anything like that with international law?
Yeah. So, I mean, the UN has a registry certainly for all multinational treaties that are UN treaties. It's not every single treaty, but a lot of the treaties are there. Yeah, some are secret. Absolutely. There are plenty of secret treaties. And then bilateral treaties are not necessarily all registered with the United Nations. So bilateral treaties being just, one country agrees with another. But a lot of them are registered with the United Nations. And now we have, of course, global systems for managing international agreements. And so a lot of these are registered and available. You can get them online. I mean, there are ways in which you can get these registered international agreements, not every single one of them, but the vast majority. And in the United States, all international agreements have to be reported to Congress. Congress has to publish them under something called the CASE Act, Case-a-Blocky Act, that requires that these agreements be made public. But It's a whole separate story we could talk about. Not every single one is made public. I've actually written about the importance of greater transparency for international agreements and why those ought to all be published and made.
Oh boy, do I
available
agree with you, and I'm going to
American
talk about
public.
that too.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
So we have international agreements, and then we built a whole. I can't even imagine how big this is or how many there are, but international institutions to enforce, adjudicate, and to, I guess, help make and keep those agreements.
Yeah, I mean, they're sort of managerial organizations, right? In many cases, it's not so much about enforcement, although they often entail some enforcement mechanisms, but often it's just about, look, states are creating these agreements because they have a benefit from creating these agreements, right? States are joining into these agreements because they think, hey, this is in my mutual interest. And then they create these organizations to help, sometimes to resolve disputes, to manage it, to update it. There's something like the International Coffee Organization, so coffee growing nations create their international organization. They have a treaty that they agree to, and then they have a council that meets on a regular basis to oversee the agreement and make sure that it's updated and that it's managed. So there are thousands of international organizations on, obviously the United Nations, but then, all the way down to much smaller organizations.
Well, the one you named that manages the internet, or the one that makes sure that postal system works globally.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I have two sort of threshold questions, maybe more, about whether it's sustainable. One is, I'm going to say my opinion here, and you do not have to agree with it. You can consider it hypothetical for this question. But we have the most corrupt government we've ever had. We have a weaponized Justice Department. Congress has ceded to the executive branch the powers of the purse and the power to wage war. Today, for God's sake, is the threshold day for the War Powers Act. I know you wrote about that this morning. That says that war has to cease unless Congress acts. Congress won't act, and that war won't cease. So it's, whether you agree with that or not, the rule of law, in my view, and at least for this hypothetical, is in danger in the United States. Yeah. Can an international law system exist when a nation as large and powerful as ours decides that the rule of law doesn't matter?
Yeah, it makes it much harder, right? I mean, look, we've just talked about how complex and multidimensional the international legal order is. And even as the president is sort of putting under threat the UN Charter, ignoring the UN Charter, waging a war that seems to be in tension, at least, with our obligations under the Geneva Conventions, and, violating rules relating to the law of the sea and putting in place the blockades. Like, there's lots of ways in which he's violating the law. Even so, lots of other stuff is still happening just as it always has, right? We're still sending our letters. We're still, doing overflight. We're still, goods and services are traversing international boundaries. A lot of the stuff is still happening. I just was at the American Society of International Law's annual meeting, over 1,000 international lawyers in one place, half of them practitioners. They have very robust day jobs. They're working hard. There's a lot to be done, right? So international business transactions, all these things, this is all happening still. And nothing the president's doing is going to stop that. But over time, the erosion of trust, the erosion of security, the erosion of safety, the erosion of trust in international law, and the erosion of trust in the United States as a good player, as a state that can be trusted, as a state that is going to play by the rules, as a state that's going to be stable, that a state that will do what it says it's going to do, that is going to significantly undermine the system as a whole. And that could put the rest of it at risk. I think it's, at the moment, things are still moving along, and those things will continue to exist regardless. Having a state like the United States prepared to sort of chuck international law out the window is not good for the international system, no doubt about it. It doesn't mean the whole thing grounds to a halt. Things are keeping on, but it does put the whole thing at risk. Yeah, I mean, and lots of things that, every ordinary person is going to care about.
Yep. Well, that's, so our behavior impacts it that way. And one other way, when this system was put in place post World War II, It was the partnership between America and Europe that largely did it and largely made it successful and legitimized it. That partnership is also in jeopardy at the moment by this administration. I mean, after all, if Russia's attacking from one side, we should say we'll take Greenland on the other. That's not a friendly act, right? The legitimacy of the system has to. Let me say it differently. As you pointed out, the need persists. People want to do international work. They want to do international travel. They want to do international communications, all of which requires some. I mean, you can't just walk around the world anymore. There are borders. There are all kinds of things. There have to be rules. Yeah. If we make them illegitimate, if the powers that made them legitimate and gave them their legitimacy don't no longer agree, the question is, does it disappear? Or does someone else step in and give it legitimacy? And here I'm thinking China, because that sure sounds like what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think that, the United States is going to withdraw, has already been withdrawing from the international system in the ways that we've talked about, also literally withdrawing from international agreements, in ways that just make zero sense, like pulling out of the International Law Commission. That's where you make international law. You influence the creation of international law. Like pulling out of that is just really hard to imagine what the logic is there. Whether you believe in international law or not, like you want a seat at the table. And who's stepping into those seats? Who's stepping into the places where we're withdrawing? Yeah, definitely. China is playing a significant role. This is a great opportunity for China to take a leadership role in the world. That happened with World Health Organization. We pulled out of it. China stepped right in. And to some degree, it's to their credit, right? Like, I mean, they're helping to keep some of these organizations go, but
and to their benefit.
It's absolutely to their benefit. And the thing is, they understand how much power and authority and legitimacy you get from being a leader in these international organizations, and how much you can accomplish through being a part of these international organizations that you could never accomplish on your own. And they have been wanting to have this opportunity for a long time, and it's just being delivered up to them on a silver platter, right? I mean, it is really extraordinary.
We're throwing it away.
We are completely throwing it away. We're completely throwing it away. Yeah, it's what's so maddening about it is that the justification is strengthening the United States, but it's doing the exact opposite. I mean, it is so weakening the United States to just give up this authority and power that we have worked hard to create over the course of really since World War I. We have been the leaders in the international system. We have been shaping this international system. We literally wrote the UN Charter. It was a small working group within the U.S. State Department that wrote the first draft of the UN Charter. We championed it. It reflects our values and our interests, and we're just chucking that out the window. And it's just it's unfathomable because it's so frustrating as an international layer. Like, of course, I care about international law, but I'm an American too, and I care deeply about America, and I care about us doing what makes sense for the United States and its standing in the world, and its ability to reflect and pursue its values. And we're just giving that up. We're just giving that up, and it's just impossible to square with what they say they're doing and what they're actually accomplishing.
And this also extends to the global financial system, which has been enormously beneficial to the United States. And I know China's wanted to replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. They don't have to succeed in doing it to undermine the system that we put in place.
Yeah, well, and we are really shooting ourselves in the feet there too, right? So all these sanctions that we're putting in place, all the tariffs that we're slapping on countries with the kind of willy-nilly use of sanctions against judges and lawyers at the International Criminal Court, all these things that we're doing is encouraging de-dollarization. And, there's a tipping point. We don't know exactly when that tipping point is going to arrive. Like the dollar has been the reserve currency of choice for a really long time. It hasn't really had a serious competitor, and we've been able to, that has given us extraordinary authority and power. because basically all major financial transactions have to be done in the dollar.
Yep.
And that means the United States just has so much ability to leverage its financial position with the rest of the world. And that's what brought Iran, frankly, to the negotiating table the first time with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Was we basically put in place what's called secondary sanctions,
Right.
which is powerful because what they say is like, you have to choose. You do business with Iranian banks, or you do business with American banks. And everybody's like, we're doing business with American banks. Like, that's not a
Not
choice,
even question.
right? Not even close. And so like Iran's like, we have no choice. We're being strangled. Like, we have to show up at the negotiating table. Well, we're now encouraging states to look elsewhere. We're encouraging states to start doing their deals in, other currencies. And it hasn't broken yet, but it will. If we keep this up, it will. And then we're going to understand how much authority and power we had that we just gave away, that we just destroyed. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a much less a reported aspect of this that people are not really paying attention to, is the fact that, like, we take for granted that all business is going to be done in the US dollar, but that is a result of like good, careful management of our currency. I mean, our debt just reached 100% of our GDP, like extraordinary. And the instability that comes from that is significant. So it's been decades of like careful management of the dollar, of being reliable, of using sanctions only in cases that were sort of justifiable and consistent with international legal commitments. And we're just throwing that all out the window.
Yeah. All right. Well, so we're throwing this away, much to our peril. And now, so let's talk about why we're doing this. I was working in the UK a lot during the Brexit debate.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw how vulnerable international institutions are to claims that they cost individuals their sovereignty. Oh, yeah. I can't tell you how many times I heard, those faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, and we don't control our own borders. Heard that here after that. I mean, the same language that works in one place works in another to convince people that international law is just bad for us. It just means that we have no say, that somebody over there, and it is tied to an ancient, there's a secret international order, usually means Jews, that really are controlling everything, and we don't have any control, and it's time. Yeah.
This idea of sovereignty is a really interesting one, right? People often talk about it, and they don't really know what they mean when they use that word. It's like something kind of like, we care about American sovereignty, or we care about British sovereignty. And I think what they're trying to reflect is this idea of control, or, control over their own lives, control over the world, what exactly, but I think it's control over their territory, over their own policies, over their own, over their own government. And I think, I've spent a lot of my career sort of puzzling over that, because it's not a new critique of international law. The international law somehow undermines sovereignty, right? This has been a longstanding critique of international law. You're giving away your sovereignty when you're agreeing to this agreement. I think what people don't understand when they make that critique is that, we live in a globalized world. No state can exist on its own. No state can exist without interaction with other states. I mean, they could perhaps in theory do that, but they would be much poorer for it. North Korea is a good example of a state that sort of kind of tried to do it on its own, and its people are starving.
Yeah, Albania for a long time.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, these are, right. Like, that's what you get when you close yourself off from everybody else. You get lots of sovereignty, but you get like, inability to feed your own people, like, inability to really have any influence outside your own borders. And most of international law, again, it's international law grounded in state consent. A treaty does not exist, does not bind a state unless the state has agreed to the treaty. And why do states agree to treaties? Because the people who are making the decisions, which are the representatives of, in the United States, representatives of the American people, think that it's in the American best interest. Why do they think that? Well, because It usually is. They're generally right,
Well, how do you deal with this
yeah.
case? Let's say the treaty, we enter into a treaty. It is in the best interest of the American people, and we feel that way. Times change, and we think, maybe it's not in our best interest anymore. But the pace of changing these international agreements is a lot slower than the pace of calling your local city council person to say, I need a stop sign at the end of my block, and dealing with it. And you feel like it's not responsive anymore, and that you're somehow trapped in a system that is no longer as flexible as we need to be for the lives we live.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there are situations where withdrawal from a treaty is appropriate, right? So let's say you join a treaty and that over time it no longer serves the state's best interests. The vast majority of treaties have explicit withdrawal provisions that say, here's how you get out, and you can make the decision to get out, and that's lawful. In other cases, there are treaties that, when you first joined, you thought you were getting one thing, maybe you end up getting another thing, or, in this particular instance, it's not exactly serving your interests, but over the long haul, it does, and so I think the question is, in some instances with those treaties, you're agreeing to do some things in the short term that you might maybe not prefer to do, but it gives you the authority to get other states to also do what they would not necessarily choose to do. So like take the World Trade Organization, it has limitations on the kinds of trade restrictions you can put in place on the import of goods from other countries. And there are instances where states are like, I would really like to put really high tariffs on steel. I would really like to put really high tariffs on agricultural goods because, my domestic industry is hurting. And the international organization, the GATT, the international organization, the Government Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, basically put limits on what you can do. There are constraints on how often you can do that, when you can do it, and how you can do it. And you might violate the rules to do that. But so in that instance, you have a choice. Do you stay in it? Do you break it? Or do you comply with it? And those are all available options, so you could withdraw altogether, but then you lose access to the lower trade barriers from every other country that's a party to the World Trade Organization, which are huge benefits that you're getting because everybody else has to do the exact same thing, right? They all also have to let American goods in that they might prefer to put limitations on, but they can't because they're legally prohibited from doing it. So I think you have to decide, yes, okay, in this instance, maybe there's some things I would rather do if I had my druthers, but the constraints on my action now means that I get access to a lot of things that are really important to me, like lower access to send my exports abroad without them being taxed by these other countries. And that in the end is best for the American economy, even though, in the short term, in this particular way, I don't really love what it's doing. And that's the kind of choices you have to make with international law. Sometimes you decide the trade-offs aren't worth it and you pull out altogether, but you don't want to just look at the short-term costs and say, okay, in this one instance, it's causing me to do something I'd rather not do, without taking account of the fact that there's all these benefits that you're getting from being a part of this international agreement.
So the you in that description that you just gave, you have these things to consider. You decide whether you want to stay or go. You decide whether you want to just violate it and get called on it later, but keep the whole thing in place. The question of who is you is a problem for voters everywhere, right? Yeah. Because it feels like you have to be a Yale brilliant scholar, part of that you. And that the average voter is like, who's you? I don't know who these organizations are. I don't know who's in them. It doesn't occur to them that and I'm even sure the members of Congress know who's in them, So how do we make this something that people can not only can benefit from, but can trust?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something I struggle with, and I'm trying to figure out the answer to that question.
Well, you teach it. Part of it is to teach.
I do teach it. Yeah, I teach it. And, and I'm taking on the presidency of the American Society of International Law. And one of the things I'm trying to think about is how do we do a better job explaining this to the general public? I think one of the challenges is that it can get very technical very fast. But there are ways of explaining these things in fairly simple terms as well, right? The idea that, when you make a deal with another country, they're going to let your goods in without putting, slapping tariffs on them. And you're going to let their goods in without slapping tariffs on them. And it's in everybody's best interest to basically bind themselves to agree to that. I think that's fairly straightforward. I mean, I think that people can understand the basics of it, right?
I understand that, but like we have, I think, just over 1 million elected offices in the United States. We're used to knowing who's the one who's making the decision, right? And that goes from school board to, in Chicago, like mosquito abatement district, right? We elect people to all kinds of things. So we know who they are. And if we don't like it, we can go call on them. But all of these international organizations, that's not how it works. And we have no idea who are these people making these decisions, and who are they accountable to is a very opaque world. And it asks a lot of citizens. I mean, when I was in London, you kind of knew who you sent to Brussels, and still it was opaque.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique. And I think it's one of the reasons that people feel a kind of sense of like disconnection or lack of understanding of these international organizations, and sort of maybe a kind of reflexive skepticism of them because they feel so far away, they feel so technical, they feel foreign, literally.
We don't know who's on them. We don't know
who's on them. I mean, I think the thing to remember, though, is that those organizations can only do what we've agreed to, right? So we've entered into a treaty that creates a set of rules, and those international organizations really are about enforcing the rules that we've written and that we've agreed to. And that these international organizations have extremely constrained power to act on their own. Very few of them can sort of like just say, okay, we're going to change this or that. The reason that you have to have these international organizations with an assembly of state parties, which is usually these international organizations have the state parties, have a regular conference, is if you're going to change anything, you got to go back to the states that made the international organization and say, hey, here's what we want to do. And we want to change this thing. And here's how we want to change it. So it's really the U.S. State Department, in most cases, and the Secretary of Defense, and then the people within the State Department that are under the Secretary of Defense, they're making these decisions for the American people. And then in Congress, it's the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that approves international agreements. So it is our members in the end it's our representatives in the end that are making these decisions. So I think people shouldn't feel too much like, oh, we're giving away this power to these international kind of overlords, who are running the show. That authority is extremely constrained.
And we send representatives to sit on these different bodies.
Absolutely. Yes.
Who makes the decision of who sends them? Is that an administrative decision?
It's in the most case. Yep. Yeah, in the most cases, the executive branch. It's the executive branch, but it varies across the different organizations. It's often the State Department, though, that is making those decisions. Of course, we have ambassadors all around the world who are also representing us in discussions. But yeah, we usually have someone who's authorized to speak on behalf of the United States through the State Department, who's representing us in our interests, and they're ultimately answerable to us. They're answerable to us because they're answerable. They only have the authority that they're given by the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of State is supposed to be accountable to all of us. That accountability hasn't been working very well lately.
That's a different topic for sure. An important one. But every organization, even domestically, I was a long time ago as a young man was on the Chicago City Council, and piles of my colleagues went to jail. So even institutions where everybody, they can become corrupt.
Yeah.
And there's always there's been the claim about the UN for a long time in America that it's corrupt, that it's just doesn't do its job. It's wasting piles of money, lining people's pockets, whatever. How do we again, it requires a lot of transparency to evaluate that challenge, that charge. How do we know? How do we assure Americans that these institutions either aren't corrupt or there's a mechanism in place, as there is here in Chicago for the culling of crooked aldermen, that will make sure that it heads in the direction that we want it to head in.
Yeah, I mean, look, these are legitimate concerns always with government, any kind of government, whether it's domestic, whether it's local, whether it's international, to ensure that the money's being spent wisely and that there are the necessary controls in place to ensure that the money is being used for the purposes that it has been devoted. And there are internal controls within the UN for exactly that, and also transparency mechanisms to ensure that money's been wisely spent. It's a lot smaller budget than you might imagine for the amount of things that it does. Is there bloat? Yes, there certainly is. I mean, part of the reason for that is that you've got an organization with 193 states that are party to it, and lots of states want to have their say, and they want to have seats at the table, and so there's a lot of efforts to kind of accommodate that, right?
Totally. It will never be it will never be an organization designed to be efficient. That's
right.
Not what it's for. It's designed for different purposes.
Right. It's designed for collaboration and cooperation, and it does that really well. I mean, are there ways in which elements of it could be made more efficient? Sure, absolutely. And I think that there's efforts to try and look for that. And I think it's an appropriate thing to ask. There's going to be a new Secretary General coming in. That should be one of the things that, the U.S. in interviewing Secretary General candidates should be asking, how are you going to ensure that the money is spent for the purposes that it's intended? And how do you make sure that proper financial controls are going to be in place? But look, it does in a remarkable amount that saves us a lot of money, I will say. So just take UN peacekeeping missions. UN peacekeeping missions have been remarkably successful. The independent scholarly work on the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping missions in places of conflict suggests that they reduce the amount of ongoing conflict. They save people's lives. They prevent the harm, and they prevent U.S. soldiers from having to come and solve problems down the road. Saves us a lot of money. So I think we don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish. There's a lot of ways in which UNESCO does important things for saving children's lives, providing basic food and support, medical support and the rest for children that allows them to grow up healthy and strong and, lead productive lives that contribute to the global economy. So there are a lot of things that the UN does that are, pay dividends many times over.
I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I don't mean to be asking a question that challenges its mission or even its value, but in order to protect that, look again, to go back to my city council example.
Yeah.
I think it's really important. I think it's good that we have one, right? But when people get corrupt, they get indicted and convicted and taken away, and we go have another election. I mean, are there examples where people in the UN have been indicted, convicted, taken away, like any other, like the United States Senate, like any body of government that we have? It encourages humans to sometimes do some things they shouldn't do. And
it's a good question.
And we hold them accountable.
Yeah, it's a fair question. Look, I think there are a lot of eyes looking on everything that's happening at the UN. And I think it's not so easy to get away with something like that. Because there's so many interested parties who are involved who are keeping an eye on things. But yeah, look, I'm not aware of any allegations of corruption that haven't been investigated and prosecuted. And I think I know that there's plenty of allegations running around there, but I don't think that any of them have been backed up with facts. People just look at the fact that this is a big organization and they figure, there must be some corruption going on there. I don't know that I have seen any claims.
It's interesting that there isn't a policing mechanism as there is in American government, right?
I think that there is. I don't pretend to be an expert on the sort of bureaucratic inner workings of the United Nations, but I do know that they're very sensitive to these kinds of critiques, and they understand states are not going to give their contributions that they're required to give if they don't believe that money is being spent for the purposes it's supposed to be spent for. And there are, ordinary public accounting and oversight tools and mechanisms in the UN, just as there are in any significant international organization.
That's good.
And from what I understand, those have been very effective. And I haven't seen any credible claims that there's been a significant breakdown that leads us to think that there's a real problem here.
The one that's been in, I'm sorry to do this, the one that's been in the news most
is whether the High Commission on Refugees somehow was complicit in the Hamas attack, right? And that kind of talk sounds more political than real to me, but it certainly has an impact on how people feel about the organization and how does it defend itself in real time.
Yeah. I mean, so there's two different questions there, right? There's the question of like, is there corruption, i.e. like private stealing? And then there's the question of like, is the money going to fund organizations right. And this came up with UNRWA and its connections and work in Gaza. And frankly, there are a lot of places like Gaza, like Yemen, where there are conflict situations where the governing entities on the ground are entities that we would regard as terrorist organizations, right? So same problem in Yemen, same problem in another number of conflict areas where you have a non-state actor group that controls an area, that effectively governs an area. And Hamas has been governing Gaza for quite some time. They have the police. They are the government they do all the governmental services. They run the schools, they run the, fire department, they do all these things. Right. And so if you're going to be doing humanitarian work, you have to work with the folks who actually are governing the place where you're doing that humanitarian work. And there is a choice. Like, do you say, well, as long as this terrorist organization, is running the show, we're going to have nothing to do with it. And we're not going to provide any money to like allow children to be able to eat, to allow there to be clean water, to allow, hospitals to function. Or, and this is a choice that the Obama administration was facing in Yemen was, this is a similar problem. Do we keep a terrorist designation in place that means that NGOs can't provide basic humanitarian support to people who are dying of cholera, like worst cholera epidemic in modern history took place in Yemen? Do we just basically say like, not our problem, like people are dying, massive, like horrific things happening on the ground. Children are, not getting enough food to eat. Like but terrorists are the ones who are running the show. So we can't do anything. Not only can we not do anything, we can't let anybody else do anything either, because if there's a terrorist designation,
right, that's what that
NGOs
does.
Can't operate without being at risk of criminal prosecution. And, so these are the hard choices that humanitarians have to make all the time. Like, do you say that, we're not going to provide this basic humanitarian aid in places where the governing organization is one that is engaging in terrorist activities? Or do we say, look, we're not going to support anything that they're doing. Like, obviously, we're not going to support the terrorist activities that they're undertaking, but we're going to do the best we can to allow people to have the minimum that they need to be able to survive.
Right. We make these choices all the time, and we don't always make them well. I think of Cuba, which is very near here, and the suffering that's going on there. And but the Castro family regime 60 years ago decided to point some nuclear weapons our way, and that's not something you forgive easily, right? Yeah. So it's a very tough question. It's very
tough, right? And I think, and I mean, I have to, putting my own cards on the table. Like, I think in the end, like, saving children from starvation is
something you do.
A higher value, right? Like,
yes,
something you do, right? And does that mean that sometimes you have to work with people that you think are abhorrent, and that, you think, should not be in charge, and that you would do everything you could to prevent them from carrying out their aims? But sometimes you nonetheless have to be able to do business with them on this very basic level. I think that that's the choice that the UN is sometimes faced with, because it is in the worst conflict situations in the world. And the worst conflict situations in the world don't have functioning governments. That's the reality of it. So
they don't have the very thing that we've been talking about, which is international law. They don't have these rules that we don't see, that have protected us in so many ways.
Yes. Right.
So if we decide, if a wand gets waved and either the current administration has a change of heart about their view of the world, or they disappear and a different takes place, and we decide to re-engage in the world, really re-engage, what are the things that we need to do to undo the damage that's been done? And what are the things that we could do differently than we did in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to ask. So first of all, I think that our trust is at a new low. I lived in Germany in the fall, and talked to lots of Europeans, and I spend time at the UN and talked to lots of representatives at the UN and traditional allies, people who believe in America, who believed in the message of who we are and what we stood for, and who have seen America as a bright and shining light, that sets an example for the world, are kind of paralyzed by the disconnect between that image of who we are and what we are doing in the world right now. And the things we're saying and the things that we're doing are just so much at odds with that long held view about who America is. That is, it's really extraordinary to talk to people who just can't quite compute, what they're seeing, the America that they thought they knew doing in the world, which is so at odds with this history. And I think it's shaken our longstanding allies. It's shaken them. It's shaken their trust. And I don't think that just sort of voting somebody into office, whether Republican or Democratic, who is like going to talk about much better game about the international order and sort of want to make nice, is going to be enough. Because we did that. We voted Biden into office. And he sort of made nice with everybody, and then we voted Trump in office, and he came in, much worse than he was the first time around. And everybody kind of knew what he was going to do, and the American people voted for it. So, I think there's a lot of lack of trust. I think we've probably done generational harm to our standing in the world. I think it's going to take a generation to really build that trust. But I think the first step is going to have to be what Biden didn't do, which is real accountability. Real accountability for the where law has been broken. We need to call that out. I really think we need to put in place democratic reforms, like structural democratic reforms, real war powers reform, reforming emergency powers, strengthening Congress's ability to push back. Congress should have its own Office of Legal Counsel. It should have, structural mechanisms in place to be able to push back much more effectively. I think probably we're going to have to do some jurisdiction stripping with the Supreme Court. I just think the Supreme Court has been really undermining the ability of Congress to put any kind of real constraints on the executive branch. But like a whole host of democratic structural reforms to basically ensure that if we have out of control executive branch again, that they're not going to be able to do so much damage so fast.
This is fascinating. It's fascinating because as I hear you, I just want to repeat it to make sure I understand it. The best thing that we can do to restore, to build a better future in international law is to fix the rule of law in America and democracy.
I think so.
That's fascinating.
Think so.
That's really fascinating.
I think so because people see the lawlessness, and they see that that President Trump is so unconstrained that it's just his whims that are running the world. He decides on his own morality that he's going to launch a war, and the rest of the world pays the price. And that's a failure of our right. It's a failure of our Constitution. It's a failure of the War Powers Resolution. It's a failure of internal constraints to be effective. And that then leads to
international law. Yeah,
right. Exactly.
So when I asked this theoretical question earlier and said, you don't have to agree, but it's a theoretical question, I now know that you do, and I appreciate that. Listen, I love what you do. I am a believer in this question of sovereignty. Look, people get married. When they get married, they're not alone in the world anymore. It turns out that it's a good idea. And so this question of sovereignty seems silly in some ways, but I think what you do is helping to make this complicated world more transparent, its value more better understood, all of which will help it avoid the kinds of attacks it's been under. So thank you so much for
Thank
your
you.
leadership in that world.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak about these issues and for casting a light on the importance of international rule of law as well as domestic rule of law. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
Okay. For those of you who usually call in at this moment, I apologize. I'm not going to get to calls today. Been a crazy day, and I have one more guest I really wanted to get in here before we left. Maria Mozaffar is an attorney and an author. She focuses on legislation and on building cross-cultural relationships that, I don't know, that help us live in a diverse but also in an inclusive society, so we're not all in our own little bubbles. Hi there.
Hello, how are you, Edwin?
Thank you. I am good. Tell us, a little bit about your work and what you're working on now.
Sure. So I have been writing legislations for about 20 years now, and they're legislations that are focused on breaking the echo chamber in a way where they create policies to make more inclusive communities for all of us. And so, really, the legislations are state and federal, and they're designed to be able to have access points for community members to come in and be part of civic life.
Important. And you've also spent a lot of time with cross-cultural conversations. Right now, those are enormously important. How I guess I should ask, how has that changed since we have in the last year?
Well, Edwin, I'll say right now, I think there's two things that are under attack in this country. One is multiculturalism, and second is empathy. And it's actually been targeted as a toxic construct that multiculturalism is anti American and that the intent of the founders was never to have a multicultural society. And so when you analyze the intent behind the executive orders and the policies that come through the way immigration is enforced, and also the additional intention to remove birthright citizenship, what you're actually looking at is to respond to the changing demographic of this country. So either Americans, all of us have to decide that this is a multicultural society and that that is a asset to our humanity, or it's not.
That's really interesting. I mean, your answer was multiculturalism and empathy. And in the rest of this show, with the last 3 hours I've been on, we've answered that question differently, but
Mhm.
not irreconcilably differently. The
Mhm.
answer that we've given is what's under threat right now is the rule of law and civil
Mhm.
rights.
Mhm.
But right, but
Well,
those are the legal
that's tied.
consequences of the things you're talking about.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, they're completely tied, right? Because you can remove the rule of law and the civil rights protections of individuals to send them a message that this society is not multicultural. That's how it's done. So if you make it so uncomfortable for individuals to be here, to walk into hospitals, to go to schools, to walk on the streets, just because they're different, or to go in their places of worship, you're giving them a message that the rule of law is designed to protect individuals that are of a certain group, which is completely un-American. And I think what's interesting is how an administration can balance that intent, right, without crossing the line. And what we recognize is that we have crossed the line when you violate the Constitution or create policies in order to circumvent the Constitution and to discriminate based on national origin or religion or culture or ethnicity. Then you are creating a system where you are actually anti-constitution. And I think that's very interesting to make this argument is for individuals that kind of get, uncomfortable with the word multicultural and say, oh, this is all about diversity, inclusive communities. Actually, no, this is about being either pro-constitution or anti-constitution, whether you understand the intent of the founders or you don't.
You gave your answer and your focus is on our culture and on who we are, and not
Uh-huh.
on I mean, even though you're a lawyer and even though you write legislation, your focus is is cultural, and that I think is the base of all of this. So let me ask you: you live in the Chicago area, so like me, you saw and lived through the ICE invasion here. Not quite what they had in Minneapolis, but it was still painful. What did you think of the public response to that, to ICE's appearance here?
Well, I think I echo the sentiment that the candidate for Senate Abdul Sayed stated, which is public understood that what was being demonstrated is trying to push the line of using paramilitary force for civil offenses. And that's what ICE was trying to show, right? It's trying to show that, and the public recognize that, which is very interesting. I said this on another show once, that it puts Republicans in a very interesting position because that's what the Second Amendment was designed for. It's when the government takes arms against its own citizens or its own people on the streets. And so ICE was actually in the process of doing that and demonstrated that that's what it wanted to do. And I think the public recognized that. I wish that it was beyond. What we saw was beyond the struggle between individuals that were on the streets and ICE. I wish that the policies that were demanded and requested and are being demanded around the country, which is we can't have individuals that have masks and don't have IDs, was taken seriously. But as you know, the administration's response has been, we don't have money to put cameras on all of these agents, right? And
They,
we,
they, they have the money, Mario. They don't
of
have the,
course,
they don't want to
of
do it,
course,
right?
of
They have, I
course. So
mean,
that's the
they spent $1
response.
billion a day since then, closing the
Of course.
Straits of Hormuz. So they
Of
got
course.
plenty of money.
Of course. So we know that, right? And I think that connecting the dots there, that the argument that we don't have enough money is actually a code for we want to push the line of protecting our citizens and allowing them to use the Constitution to protect themselves. We want to push that line as far as we can to show that there is the ability for the American government to use paramilitary force against civil offenses. And that's a very dangerous path. It's un-American. And I think that's what Illinois recognized, and we need to continue to frame it in those terms.
So what would you ask people to do if people are tired and they're afraid? Um, this was an awful week. Just was an
Yeah.
awful week, right? And and people are worried that we will not successfully restore the rule of law, civil rights, the ability to be a diverse and interesting community, as
Right.
opposed to being a bland, all white Christian nationalist community.
Hmm. Hmm.
Which most people don't want, but they're afraid right now.
Hmm.
What's your counsel?
Well, the council is back to the statement that you reaffirmed earlier, is that this is a question of who we are culturally, right? I think I hate to uh, sound lofty here, but it is the soul of the nation that's at risk. And so, my job as a policymaker writing legislations is to take a step back, step outside of the fear, and say, what can we create and do? And what kind of innovative way can we put policy forth that actually chips away at the policies that divide us? And so my response to the public would be, let's be smarter. Let's talk about what strategically we can do. I'll give you an example. For example, there was a Religious Liberties Commission that the administration had that had organized, if you remember. And the Religious Liberties Commission, we had somebody that was kicked off. That was Catholic. We had a Muslim that resigned, and then we had a group of the Hindu community that actually filed a lawsuit for not being included in the commission. So either we can say, well, the religious liberties of these groups don't matter, or we can create innovative way to have our own town hall for religious liberties policy priorities and bring communities together. These are innovative, proactive initiatives that we have to do when no one's driving the bus on these issues, right? And so I would say be very hopeful and innovative and get on the side of what can we create policy wise to counter these issues versus playing defense. We need to play offense.
Um, Yeah, I mean, much of what I think we have to do at the moment is less about policy because we don't control the ability to make it right now. They're blocking it everywhere. It's about people. And
Hmm.
I think the more that we do to engage outside of our own communities right now, the more we build multicultural alliances and friendships even, and understandings, the stronger we're going to be as they keep, as long as they have power and on the attack. But oh,
Yeah.
when they lose power, Maria, there are things that we can do to
Oh, the
both
things
hold
we
them
can do.
accountable and to move the country into a better place.
Right, absolutely. And I would say, even if the policy is not moving forward, like you said, they're trying to block everything. The process and conversation of having those discussion, having those hearings, right? Having
Yeah,
those testimonies heard,
yeah,
even if they don't pass out a committee, you're
yeah.
setting a precedent of empowering people to be truth tellers, right? To move forth and push back. And so that is a muscle that we're going to have to flex for when things do change, where we actually do have to cross the finish line. So I think that is a process of policy making. It's not getting to the finish line tomorrow. It's a process of building that. But 100% I agree with you that that parallel process of building relationships with communities, getting to know each other. There's one thing that's very critical is raising global citizens. If you want to raise global citizens, you have to inspire a younger generation to care enough about different individuals around the world. And to be able to do that, you have to model that. And it
Yeah.
could be as basic as trying a different cuisine and going into a different neighborhood and striking a conversation that seems like you would have never had one, other than the opportunity that you're creating for yourself. And that starts very basic. That starts at the dinner table at home. That starts at work. College campuses are great for that reason. And I wish that we would have this environment right now where we have college students feel safe in different communities that can have these conversations without feeling threatened, right? Sharing their truth and moving forward, because these are the places where we will have cultural competency that organically grows into something that's permanent.
Uh, So let me unpack a little bit. First, I agree and I stand corrected. And I'm reminded that Sean Casten,
Uh-huh.
a congressman, said to me, you know what, it takes multiple cycles to pass a bill.
Uh-huh.
And we need to get started now on all of this stuff. And so you're absolutely right on the
Yeah.
legislative side. And
Yeah.
I want to ask you about college campuses. Do
Yeah.
you think that right now those conversations that kids are not able to have those conversations? As colleges such, they still sort of everybody in their own corner.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that. We started with the congressional hearings that we saw after October 7th, the
Yeah,
congressional hearings where the university presidents were brought in and they were questioned. And I think what you saw across college campuses are students being divided based on the policy initiatives that the administration at that time wanted to see and felt needed to be responsive for. And so building relationship, look, calling in a university president and setting the precedent of what is appropriate for academic discourse is not going to change how college students feel about each other. Right? They're not
that's
going to
right.
learn from each other. So we have to be able to create environments where students feel safe. If their diplomas are being revoked based on the truth that they are experiencing, then we need to go a little bit deeper to have those conversations. And I've seen this across the board around the country. And I will say, there's so many Jewish students around the country who are feeling this tug here, especially with anti-Semitism and the Stop Anti-Semitism campaign. I know that for a fact, that they're feeling this tug here where they want to be in a space where they can have a conversation and not feel like they represent an idea or a policy agenda item that they are not putting forth themselves. And the Muslim college students or students that are pro-Palestinian on this specific issue, because this is a specific issue on college campuses for us to discuss, they are feeling the same pull. They don't want to be silenced, but they want to continue their relationship to speak openly with Jewish students. And so that is a perfect example for us to see that the academic freedom of discourse has to be protected at all costs. And when we don't see that happening, we're building a precedent to say, even though college campuses are the last place where individuals will have classmates sitting next to each other that are not like them, right? They're designed to have you interact with people that are not like you. If that place we are pulling apart for political agendas, we're creating a generation of individuals that don't know how to talk to each other. And that's extremely dangerous for our policies that we want to push forth.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic than you. I think schools originally were overwhelmed a couple of years ago,
Mhm.
and have caught up a little bit in an attempt to find safe space for students to talk to each other. Um, and I think students recognized that the way both that the way that particular conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza was unfolding is so tragic that
Mm-hmm.
the standards of protest on both sides did not rise to the moral moment.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
was a different kind of conversation that had to
Different kind of
happen.
conversation.
And and
Yeah.
and I think and again, kids are pretty smart. When they were banging their head against a rock for a while, I think they
Mm-hmm.
figured out maybe we need to do something different.
Yeah. No, I do agree. There were moments where and I think universities have also understood that students are asking to be part of the process, right?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think that's critical.
Yeah. And that is, um, I don't think the world's most intractable issue, but it is the one that resonates here. I mean, that's the one that taught a young generation of Americans what war is, and that because
Hmm.
they didn't know it,
Right.
and that's despite the fact that the United States has been at war all their lives, um, and and uh, and there are bigger, more horrid tragedies in the Sudan and other places.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's the one that taught a generation how miserable war is.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm glad we learned because we'll always make that mistake, as particularly when you have an administration that doesn't know the difference between a strategy and a target list.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I agree with that description. And I think social media changed the game completely,
We'll talk
right?
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, social media puts war at the front seat. It made it viewable, right? It made
Yeah.
it something that you can experience. And I will say that,
Do you think I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you think it
yeah,
also made it a bit of a game? And so
in
that,
what sense?
it made it kind of a game so people didn't take it completely seriously?
It depends on what you watch and how it impacted you.
Yeah, yeah,
That's what you know what I mean?
yeah.
So I feel like some things you cannot unsee. And so I think there are individuals that really for the first time saw things that they were not able to swallow
Mm,
and really absorb. And I
mhm,
think that that's a necessary witness that we had. Look, I mean, I was recently 2 years, well, a year and a half ago, I was in Bosnia. And I went to the museum where they, shared the story of how everything happened in Bosnia. And there were so many things that I was not able to witness, just read about until I went to that museum. So
mhm.
this social media aspect of this whole conflict has changed completely for people. It has
Yeah, it's
woken up
interesting.
humanity in a different way, and it has forced different types of narratives to be spoken about, right? That we didn't hear about. And I think what we cannot do is pretend that people didn't see certain things. We can't do that. We can't do that. And I think that it also was a unifier of humanity, because you saw a lot of people who don't see eye to eye on some things, but understood the pain that they saw watching these things. And so the question is, when we're talking about war and we're talking about decisions about military offensive campaigns or defensive campaigns, should the visibility of watching the destruction of humanity in the actual cost of war, should that play a role in our decisions? That's, I think, a decision we have to make, right? And the
I vote
argument,
yes. I vote
yes,
absolutely
I
yes.
vote yes too.
Like, do not hide the horror from people.
Yeah, I vote yes
Yeah,
too. It is very hard to say that, but I vote yes because you actually get to experience what the depths of this pain
yeah,
is.
yeah.
And not only that, when what that does to a community when they experience that pain, what could it invoke?
Mhm.
Right? I mean, this is game theory too. This is strategic thinking as well. What could it invoke in a generation of youth?
Well,
Um,
so we have like a minute left,
yeah.
and I want to just in that minute, the work that you do is affirming. You take these pain points and you figure out how
Mhm.
people get together and move past them, or at least find other things of value in the relationships.
Yeah.
So can give people some counsel on how to do that in their lives.
I think I would say get out of your own way. Get out of your own way and be very open to what humanity is showing you. Because I think the political rhetoric has helped. And I think it is harmful and blinding. And don't make it so complicated. You know,
All right, if
don't make it
somebody
so
wants to find
complicated.
your work, how do they do it?
So you can go to my Instagram or you can go to my website. That's the best way. That's my full name.com, MAARIAMOZAFFAR.com. Hopefully you can find it somewhere on your show's website, but that's the best way.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Edwin.
Bye. And for all of you, thank you for sticking with me through technical issues and a really interesting, different kind of show. I promise next week we will get to your calls.